The mist arrived before the evening did, descending from the jagged spine of the mountains like a heavy, wet blanket woven from the coldest threads of the sky. It did not roll in with the violence of a storm, nor did it carry the energy of a wind that seeks to change the world. It simply settled. It sank into the valleys and the ravines, filling the spaces between the ancient pines and the gray rocks until the world below the timberline was submerged in a sea of silent, opaque white. At the border checkpoint, the transition was gradual, a slow fading of the visible world until only the immediate was left. The grand vistas of the pass, the towering peaks that usually framed the horizon in sharp relief, dissolved into the softness of the cloud. The colors of the afternoon, the pale blues and the weak yellows of a winter sun, were swallowed by the gray. It was a gray that felt physical, a particulate suspension of water and cold air that clung to the wool of a coat and the glass of a lantern. Here at the edge of the territory, the outpost stood as a solitary island in this ocean of vapor. It was a small structure, a wooden booth weathered by decades of winters, its timber planks bleached to the color of driftwood and grooved by the relentless scratching of ice and wind. To the eye, it might appear as a sketch on dark paper, drawn with soft, crumbling pastels in shades of charcoal, slate, and indigo. The lines of the roof were softened by a thick layer of snow, a white cap that hung over the eaves like a heavy brow, dripping slow, rhythmic tears of meltwater that froze before they could reach the ground. The darkness of the surrounding forest was absolute, a deep, textured black where the trees stood as silent sentinels, their needles hidden within the fog, their presence only known by the damp, resinous scent that drifted on the heavy air. Inside the booth, the world was condensed to a space no larger than a few paces across. The air here was stale, recycled, and thick with the smell of kerosene and old paper. A single lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling, its flame a small, trembling heart of amber light that pushed against the encroaching shadows. The light did not reach far. It illuminated the wooden desk, the surface of which was polished smooth by the elbows of 1,000 knights, and it cast long, wavering shadows that danced on the walls whenever the draft caught the flame. The light caught the texture of the wood, highlighting the grain, the knots, and the deep cracks where the cold had split the timber years ago. It bathed the interior in a warm, sepia glow that contrasted sharply with the blue-gray hostility of the twilight outside. The guard sat on a high stool, his posture one of practiced stillness. He was a fixture of the booth, as much a part of the architecture as the window frame or the iron stove in the corner. His uniform was made of thick, scratchy wool, dyed a dark, nondescript green that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. The fabric was heavy, burdened by the dampness that permeated everything in the pass. It smelled of wet sheep, of tobacco smoke, and of the metallic tang of the coal stove. He did not move. His hands rested on the desk, the skin pale and dry, the knuckles roughened by the cold. Between his fingers he held a fountain pen, the nib hovering over a ledger that lay open before him. The ink in the well was black, a liquid mirror that held a tiny reflection of the lantern flame. There was no traffic. There had been no traffic for hours. The road that led to the checkpoint was a ribbon of cobblestones, slick with moisture and bordered by banks of dirty snow. It disappeared into the mist a mere dozen yards beyond the barrier gate, a wooden arm painted with alternating stripes of red and white, now faded to rust and cream. The gate was down, a horizontal line barring entry to a world that could no longer be seen. The silence was profound. It was not the empty silence of a vacuum, but the heavy, muffled silence of deep snow and thick fog. It was a silence that dampened sound, pressing against the ears like a physical weight. The only noises were the microscopic sounds of the booth itself, the hiss of the lantern, the settling of the wooden beams as the temperature dropped, the rhythmic, wet tick of condensation dripping from the window pane onto the sill. The guard watched the window. The glass was old, rippled, and imperfect, distorting the view of the nothingness outside. Moisture had gathered on the interior surface, forming intricate maps of droplets that merged and ran in rivulets down the glass, clearing narrow, momentary paths through the fog of breath. Through these clear streaks, the gray of the mist appeared darker, closer. It pressed against the glass, a ghostly face seeking entry. The cold radiated from the window, a steady, invisible emanation that chilled the air near the desk. The guard shifted slightly, the wool of his coat whispering against itself, a dry, rasping sound that seemed loud in the quiet. He reached out and adjusted the wick of the lantern, a small turn of a brass wheel. The flame jumped, then settled, the light shifting from a dull orange to a brighter yellow, revealing the dust motes floating in the stagnant air. He looked down at the ledger. It was a large book bound in heavy canvas that had once been beige but was now stained with the oils of many hands and the grime of the stove. The pages were ruled with thin blue lines, a grid of order imposed on the chaos of travel. Each line represented a person, a traveler, a document inspected and stamped. Name, date of birth, origin, destination, purpose of travel. The columns were filled with handwriting of various styles, some slanted and hurried, others upright and precise. The ink varied from fading blue to deep black to a rare violet. The guard read the last entry, written hours ago. A merchant wagon carrying textiles. He traced the letters with his eyes, not reading the meaning, but observing the shape of the ink on the paper. The loop of the L, the cross of the T. The paper itself was fibrous and coarse, a cheap government stock that absorbed the ink quickly, blurring the edges of the letters. The act of waiting was the primary duty. It was not a passive waiting, but an active endurance. It was the job of occupying space, of being the human component in a machine of borders and regulations that stretched across the continent. The guard felt the cold seeping through the floorboards, coming up through the soles of his heavy leather boots. He wiggled his toes, a small, invisible motion to keep the blood moving. The boots were stiff, the leather cracking at the flex points, laced tight with rough cord. He could feel the texture of his socks, 2 pairs rubbing against his skin. The cold was a patient adversary. It found the gaps in the insulation, the seams in the clothing, the cracks in the walls. It waited for the fire in the stove to die down, for the movement of the body to cease. He looked at the stove. It was a small, cast-iron potbelly stove, standing on a square of brick in the corner of the booth. The metal was black, dulled by heat and age. Inside, a bed of coals glowed with a sullen, deep red heat, pulsing slowly like the breathing of a dormant beast. The heat it threw was localized, creating a small sphere of warmth that barely reached the desk. Outside that sphere, the air was frigid. The guard picked up a small iron poker and opened the stove door. The hinges shrieked, a sharp metal-on-metal cry that cut through the silence. He poked the coals, breaking apart a clump of unburnt clinker, exposing the bright orange heart of the fire. Sparks rose up, swirling in the updraft, disappearing into the stovepipe that punched through the roof. He added a single lump of coal from a metal bucket, placing it carefully with a pair of tongs. The coal was black and shiny, a piece of the earth's deep memory. He watched as the heat began to attack it, the edges turning gray, small jets of gas igniting in blue flickers. Closing the stove door, he returned to the stool. The sound of the latch clicking shut was final. He picked up the stamp that sat on the desk. It was a heavy object, the handle made of turned wood, polished smooth and darkened by sweat and oil. The base was brass, holding the rubber die that bore the seal of the authority. The rubber was stained purple, the ink dried in the crevices of the crest. A double-headed eagle, or perhaps a lion, the details worn down so that it was now just a vague, authoritative shape. He held the stamp, feeling its weight, its balance. It was a tool of permission. Without the impression of this rubber on a piece of paper, the road outside remained closed, the barrier down. With it, the world opened up, allowing passage into the mist. He set it back down, aligning it perfectly with the corner of the ink pad. The ink pad was a tin box, the lid open, revealing a square of felt saturated with violet ink. The smell of the ink was chemical, sharp, cutting through the mustiness of the room. Outside, the wind began to pick up. It was not a gale, but a slow, rising breath that moved the tops of the invisible trees. A branch scraped against the roof of the booth, a dry wooden scratching that sounded like fingers seeking purchase. The fog swirled, thicker patches moving past the window like quiet ghosts. The temperature was dropping. The guard could feel it in the stiffness of his fingers, in the way his breath now formed a faint, visible plume even inside the booth. He pulled the collar of his coat up higher, the rough wool scratching against his neck. He adjusted his cap, pulling it down to cover the tops of his ears. The cap was made of the same dark green wool, with a stiff visor that cast a shadow over his eyes. He thought about the road beyond the gate. It wound its way up the pass, climbing through the forest, hugging the cliffside, crossing stone bridges over frozen streams. In this weather, the road would be treacherous. Ice would be forming on the cobblestones, invisible sheets of glaze that could send a wheel or a boot sliding into the void. The mist would hide the edge of the road, blending the snowbank with the sky. To travel now would be to travel blind, guided only by the feel of the ground and the sound of the wind. Yet someone might come. There was always the possibility of arrival. A mail carrier, a lost traveler, a convoy of trucks moving supplies to the northern garrisons. The guard had to be ready. He had to be the witness. He reached into the drawer of the desk and pulled out a tin mug. It was chipped at the rim, the white enamel revealing the dark metal beneath. A thermos flask stood next to the ledger, its silver coating dull and scratched. He unscrewed the cap, the sound of the threads turning echoing in the small space. He poured. The liquid was dark tea, strong and bitter, still steaming faintly. The steam rose in a thin, wavering column, joining the cloud of his breath. He wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat transfer to his palms. It was a small comfort, a stolen moment of warmth. He took a sip. The tea was lukewarm, tasting of tannin and tin. He swallowed, feeling the liquid move down his throat, a brief internal warmth that faded quickly. He placed the mug back on the desk, on a coaster made of cork that was crumbling at the edges. A drop of tea ran down the side of the mug and pooled on the cork, a dark, spreading stain. He watched the stain expand, slow and inevitable, until it reached the edge of the coaster and stopped. It was a landscape in miniature, a dark lake on a brown plain. Everything in the booth was old, used, worn down by the passage of time and the friction of duty. The wood, the metal, the paper, the fabric. Nothing was new. It was a place where things came to endure, to last until they fell apart. The wind sighed again, a longer, deeper exhalation this time. The flame in the lantern flickered, casting shadows that leaped up the walls and across the ceiling. For a moment the booth felt fragile, a hollow shell of wood standing against the weight of the mountain winter. The guard did not flinch. He was accustomed to the isolation. He was accustomed to the feeling of being a small, warm speck in a vast, cold darkness. He picked up the pen again, uncapping it. He checked the nib, wiping a speck of dried ink on a piece of blotting paper. The blotting paper was a landscape of its own, covered in the reverse impressions of signatures and dates, a chaotic mirror of the ledger. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was a round, mechanical clock with a brass bezel and a face that had yellowed with age. The numbers were Roman numerals, black and stark. The hands were ornate, delicate arrows of black metal. The second hand moved with a jerky, ticking motion, sweeping around the dial, marking the erosion of the night. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was the heartbeat of the room. It was slow, deliberate, unhurried. It measured a time that had no urgency, a time that belonged to the mountains and the stones. 10 minutes past the hour, or perhaps 11. It didn't matter. The schedule was a suggestion. The reality was the mist. He imagined the landscape beyond the mist. The great pine trees standing under their burdens of snow. The frozen waterfalls hanging like curtains of crystal from the cliffs. The deer bedding down in the thickets, huddled together for warmth. The wolves moving silently through the deep powder, their paws spreading wide to stay on the surface. The natural world continued its cycle of survival and dormancy, indifferent to the lines drawn on maps, indifferent to the barrier gate and the stamp. The checkpoint was a human imposition, a desperate attempt to impose order on a wilderness that recognized no authority but the wind and the ice. A sound came from outside, a soft, crunching sound. The guard lifted his head, his eyes narrowing. It was faint, barely audible over the wind. The sound of a tire rolling over gravel, the step of a boot on hard-packed snow. He listened. The sound did not repeat. He waited. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The silence rushed back in, filling the space left by the noise. It might have been a branch falling. It might have been a clump of snow sliding from the roof. It might have been the settling of the building's foundation. Or it might have been the imagination, the mind creating patterns in the static of the sensory deprivation. He stood up, his knees cracking. He walked the 2 steps to the window and leaned close to the glass, shading his eyes with his hands to block the reflection of the lantern. The cold of the glass pressed against his palms. He peered out into the gray. There was nothing. Only the swirling vapor, illuminated briefly by the spill of light from the window before fading into the charcoal darkness. The barrier gate was a vague shadow, a horizontal line drawn in soot. The snowbanks were pale, shapeless forms. He breathed out, and his breath fogged the glass, obscuring the view completely. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his coat, the rough wool smearing the condensation. He turned away from the window and looked at the door. It was a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron straps. A heavy bolt lock was mounted on the inside. It was unbolted. The checkpoint was open. He walked to the door and checked the handle, ensuring it was latched. A draft of freezing air whistled through the keyhole, a thin, icy needle that pierced the warmth of the room. He walked back to the stove and held his hands over the top, soaking in the rising heat. The metal radiated a dry, intense warmth that made the skin on his hands tingle. He rubbed them together, the dry sound of skin on skin loud in the quiet. He returned to the desk and sat down. He picked up the ledger and turned the page back, looking at the entries from the previous day. A diplomat, a family of refugees, a truck driver with a load of coal. Names, numbers, stamps. Each one a brief interaction, a moment of scrutiny, a thud of the stamp, and then the lifting of the gate. They passed through the light of the booth and vanished into the dark, heading towards destinations he would never see. He was the gatekeeper, the static point in a world of motion. He remained while they moved on. He was the anchor. The mist outside seemed to thicken, pressing closer to the glass. The world had shrunk further. Now only the booth existed. The universe was a wooden box, a stove, a lantern, and a book. The guard closed the ledger. He placed the pen next to it, parallel to the spine. He placed the stamp on the right, the ink pad on the left. Symmetry. Order. He folded his hands on the desk and stared at the flame of the lantern. He watched the blue core of the flame, the way it flickered and danced, consuming the wick, turning oil into light and heat. It was a slow chemical miracle. He let his eyes unfocus, the room blurring into a soft, warm haze. The ticking of the clock slowed down in his mind, becoming a rhythmic lullaby. Tick, tick, tick. He waited for the sound of an engine, for the flash of headlights cutting through the fog, for the knock on the door. He waited for the next passport to emerge from the mist, a document of paper and ink carried by a traveler of flesh and blood seeking passage through the night. The mist swirled, the wind sighed, the cold deepened, and the guard sat, a statue in wool, waiting in the heart of the gray. The silence that followed the settling of the mist was not empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the walls of the booth, seeking to crush the small pocket of warmth inside. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, where the glass of the window met the darkness of the night. The condensation on the pane had frozen now, transforming from liquid rivulets into a complex, crystalline map of frost. Ferns of ice grew from the corners, reaching inward with delicate, jagged fingers, their structures mimicking the branches of the pines outside. The light from the lantern caught the edges of these crystals, turning them into tiny prisms that fractured the yellow glow into microscopic spectrums of blue and violet. It was a slow, creeping geology, a glaciation occurring on a scale of inches, measuring the drop in temperature with the precision of a natural thermometer. Outside, the world had lost all depth. The fog had thickened to a viscosity that seemed almost liquid, a soup of freezing vapor that swirled sluggishly around the corners of the building. The trees, previously visible as dark sentinels, were now gone, swallowed by the whiteout. There was only the immediate, the rough wood of the window frame, the dirty snow on the sill, and the swirling gray beyond. The wind had shifted, coming now from the north, carrying with it a harder, drier cold that searched for gaps in the cladding. It whistled through the eaves, a low, mournful note that vibrated in the bones of the structure. The guard felt the draft across the floor, a current of cold air that chilled his ankles through the thick wool of his socks. He did not move his feet. To move was to acknowledge the cold, to give it power. He sat, a figure of patience carved from patience itself, waiting for the inevitable arrival that the schedule promised but the weather denied. Then a change. It began not as a sight but as a vibration, a low, rhythmic trembling that rose up through the frozen earth, through the foundation stones and into the legs of the stool. It was a subtle disturbance, a frequency so low it was felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. The tea in the mug on the desk reacted first. The surface of the dark liquid, previously a mirror of stillness, began to shiver. Concentric rings, faint and rapid, rippled outward from the center, distorting the reflection of the lantern flame. The guard watched the liquid seismograph. The trembling grew in intensity, becoming a hum, a drone that separated itself from the sound of the wind. It was the mechanical heartbeat of a heavy engine, a diesel beast laboring against the gradient and the altitude. He looked up at the window. A light appeared in the mist. It was not a beam, for the fog scattered the light instantly, diffusing it into a glowing, nebulous sphere. It was a pale, sickly yellow, a bruise of illumination on the dark skin of the night. The sphere grew larger, brighter, shifting from yellow to a warm, dirty white. It was a slow approach. The vehicle was moving at a crawl, fighting the blindness of the pass. The sound of the engine became distinct, the clatter of tappets, the heavy intake of air, the grind of gears shifting down. It was a coarse, industrial noise that intruded upon the sanctity of the natural silence. The light split into two distinct orbs, headlights heavily baffled by the weather, pushing a wall of illuminated fog before them. The vehicle emerged from the gray like a ship looming out of a storm. It was a truck, old and boxy, its metal panels painted a dull, matte gray that blended with the surroundings. The headlights were yellow eyes hooded by metal grills. The tires were massive, wrapped in chains that crunched and chewed at the hard-packed snow of the road. The sound of the chains was sharp and metallic, a rhythmic clink-crunch that echoed off the wooden walls of the booth. The truck stopped at the barrier, the air brakes hissing with a sharp release of pressure that sounded like a weary sigh. The engine did not die. It idled, a deep, chugging rhythm that shook the frame of the vehicle and sent plumes of dark, exhaust mixing with the white steam of the cold. The exhaust pipe rattled, a loose bracket adding a tinny counterpoint to the bass of the pistons. The guard stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He adjusted the belt of his coat, ensuring the fabric lay flat. He reached for the logbook, sliding it slightly to the left to make space. He checked the ink pad, opening the lid to expose the violet felt. He did not hurry. The driver would wait. The ritual of the border required a certain pacing, a deliberate friction that asserted the authority of the stationary over the mobile. He walked to the side of the booth, to the small, sliding window that faced the lane. He unlatched it. The metal was cold to the touch, biting into his fingertips. He slid the window open. The cold rushed in instantly, a physical blow of freezing air that carried the smell of unburnt diesel, hot metal, and the ozone scent of snow. The noise of the engine was louder now, a dominant roar that filled the small space. The driver's door of the truck opened with a creak of dry hinges. A figure climbed down, jumping the last foot to the ground. The boots crunched on the gravel. The driver was wrapped in layers of sheepskin, a shapeless form bulked against the weather. He walked towards the booth, his breath puffing out in white clouds that were snatched away by the wind. He stopped at the window, his face hidden in the shadow of a fur hat. No words were spoken. The interaction was a pantomime of established protocols. The driver reached into the deep pocket of his coat. The fabric was stiff, crusted with ice. He pulled out a document, a passport. He held it out, his hand encased in a thick leather glove, the leather cracked and stained with oil. The guard took the document. The transfer was brief, a passing of responsibility from the cold to the warm. The guard slid the window shut, leaving a gap of only an inch at the bottom, enough to pass the document back but narrow enough to stem the flood of cold air. He returned to the desk, carrying the passport into the pool of light cast by the lantern. It was an old document, the cover a dark blue cardboard that had softened at the corners from years of being carried in pockets and satchels. The gold leaf of the national crest on the front was worn away, leaving only the faint, debossed outline of a shield and a bird. The spine was taped with yellowing cellophane that was peeling at the edges. The book smelled of stale tobacco smoke, of dried meat, and of the peculiar, acidic scent of old paper. It was a tangible object of history, a record of movement through a world of barriers. The guard sat down and opened the book. The binding crackled. The pages were soft, almost like fabric, their edges fanned out and gray with dirt. He turned to the first page. The photograph was black and white, grainy and high contrast. It showed a man with a stern expression, his eyes staring straight ahead, his hair cropped short. The face in the photo was younger, the skin smoother, but the eyes were the same as those he imagined beneath the shadow of the fur hat outside. The name was written in a flowing, cursive script. The ink faded to a rusty brown. Anton V. The surname was long, a collection of consonants that spoke of a village deep in the Central Valleys. Date of birth, 40 years ago. Place of birth, a town that had changed names 3 times in the last century. The guard picked up a magnifying glass, a heavy brass instrument with a handle of bone. He held it over the photo, examining the embossed seal that crimped the corner of the picture and the page beneath. The relief of the seal was sharp, the tiny ridges of the paper rising up to meet the light. It was authentic. He moved the glass to the biographical data, checking for erasures, for the telltale scratching of a razor blade used to alter a date or a name. The paper was undisturbed, its fibers intact. He turned the pages, scanning the history of travel. The visa pages were a chaotic gallery of stamps, red rectangles, blue ovals, green triangles. Some were crisp and legible, the ink dark and authoritative. Others were faint, smeared by rain or sweat, their dates illegible. There were stamps from the northern ports, stamps from the southern deserts, stamps from borders that no longer existed. The guard read the story of the man's life through these marks. A crossing in winter 3 years ago. A stay of 6 months in the industrial zone. A transit visa through the archipelago. Each stamp was a permission granted, a gate opened, a barrier crossed. The passport was a testament to the friction of geography, a record of the struggle to move across the surface of the earth. Outside, the truck engine cycled, the pitch changing slightly as the thermostat opened or closed. The vibration continued to rattle the teaspoon against the side of the mug. Ching, ching, ching. A tiny metallic metronome. The guard ignored it. He was thorough. He checked the expiration date, valid for another 6 months. He checked the signature of the issuing officer. It was a scrawl he recognized, a loop and a slash that belonged to a clerk in the capital. Looked up at the window. The driver was standing there, a dark shape against the swirling gray of the headlights. He was stomping his feet, a rhythmic thumping that traveled through the ground. He was waiting. They were always waiting. The guard felt a moment of connection, a shared recognition of the absurdity of the situation. 2 men, separated by a wall of wood and glass, performing a ritual of paper and ink in the middle of a freezing void. But the connection was fleeting, dismissed as quickly as it arose. Duty was the only reality. The guard picked up the stamp. He held it for a moment, feeling its balance. He pressed it into the ink pad. The felt yielded softly. He lifted the stamp, checking the face of the die to ensure it was evenly coated with the violet liquid. He positioned it over a blank space on the 7th page of the passport. He did not rush. The placement had to be precise, not overlapping another stamp, not hanging off the edge of the page. He aligned the edges. He brought the stamp down. Thump. The sound was dull, final. A heavy, satisfying impact that resonated on the wooden desk. He lifted the stamp. The mark was left behind, a perfect violet circle, the date in the center, the name of the checkpoint curving around the top. Border Post 39. The ink glistened, wet and fresh, a new layer of history added to the book. He blew gently on the ink to help it dry, his breath a warm breeze on the paper. He watched as the sheen faded to a matte finish. He closed the passport. He picked up his pen and opened the large ledger on the desk. He found the next empty line. In the column for time, he wrote the hour and the minute. In the column for name, he copied the name from the passport. Anton V. In the column for origin, he wrote the code for the capital. In the column for destination, he wrote north. He wrote slowly, his penmanship neat and vertical, the letters standing like tiny soldiers on the line. The scratch of the nib on the paper was loud in the quiet room. He stood up, taking the passport with him. He walked back to the sliding window. He pushed it open, widening the gap. The driver stepped forward, his leather glove extending into the light. The guard placed the passport into the open hand. There was no exchange of words. No thank you, no safe travels. Such things were unnecessary, redundancies in the face of the elements. The driver took the book, nodded once, a barely perceptible dip of the fur hat, and turned away. The guard slid the window shut and latched it. He watched through the glass. The driver climbed back into the cab of the truck. The door slammed, a heavy, solid sound that cut off the noise of the idling engine for a fraction of a second before the cabin insulation dampened it. The air brakes released again, a sharp PSSHHH. The gears ground, metal teeth finding purchase. The truck lurched forward. The chains bit into the snow. The vehicle began to move, slow and lumbering, the rear wheels slipping slightly before finding traction. The guard watched the red tail lights. They were small rectangles of ruby light glowing intensely in the mist. They moved away, drifting into the gray, becoming smaller, dimmer. They became two red eyes, then two red sparks, and then they were gone, swallowed by the fog. The sound of the engine faded, the roar diminishing to a hum, the hum to a drone, the drone to a vibration, and then to nothing. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of absence. The space where the truck had been was now empty, filled only by the swirling vapor. The tracks in the snow would be filling in already, the fresh flakes erasing the evidence of passage. The guard stood at the window for a long time, looking at the place where the lights had vanished. He felt the solitude settling back onto his shoulders, a familiar cloak. The brief interruption of life had only served to highlight the emptiness of the past. He turned back to the room. The lantern flame was steady. The stove popped, a piece of coal settling in the grate. The clock on the wall ticked, tick, tick, tick. He walked to the stove and opened the door, the orange light washing over his legs. He added another lump of coal. The fire accepted it greedily. He closed the door and returned to his stool. He picked up the mug of tea. The surface was still now. The ripples were gone. He took a sip. It was cold. He drank it anyway, the bitter liquid tasting of the metal cup. He looked at the ledger. The ink of the last entry was drying, turning a dark, permanent black. One entry, one traveler. The night was young, or perhaps it was old. It was hard to tell. The mist outside pressed against the glass, a constant, heavy presence, waiting for the light to go out. The guard picked up his pen, cleaned the nib with a cloth, and set it down. He folded his hands. He waited. The wind began to moan in the chimney, a low, hollow sound that spoke of vast distances and empty spaces. The cold crept closer. The departure of the truck left a vacuum in the sonic landscape of the past that the wind was quick to fill. The heavy, mechanical thrum of the diesel engine, which had vibrated in the floorboards and the chest of the guard, was replaced by the thin, high-pitched keening of the draft pushing through the cracks in the window frame. It was a return to the baseline state of the outpost, a reversion to the elemental acoustics of stone and air. The red tail lights, which had burned like two dying embers in the gray soup of the mist, were gone, their memory fading from the retina faster than the tracks they had left in the snow. The guard remained standing at the window for a long time, watching the slow, methodical erasure of those tracks. The heavy tread of the tires had churned the pristine surface of the road, leaving deep, jagged ruts where the chains had bitten into the ice. The ridges of displaced snow were sharp and dark, mixed with the grime of the undercarriage and the soot of the exhaust. But the mountain did not tolerate scars. The snow was falling again, not in soft flakes, but in hard, tiny pellets that hissed as they struck the glass. They accumulated in the ruts, softening the edges, filling the voids. Within minutes, the sharp definition of the tire marks had blurred. Within the hour, the road would be smooth once more, a blank sheet of white paper waiting for the next inscription that would, in turn, be wiped away. He turned from the window, the movement stiff and joint-heavy. The cold that had seeped in during the brief opening of the sliding panel still lingered in the air, a phantom presence that curled around his ankles. He could feel the temperature gradient in the room, distinct layers of air stacking upon one another. Near the ceiling, where the heat from the stove and the lantern gathered, it was tepid, smelling of warm oil and dry wood. At the level of the desk, it was cool, a neutral zone where the breath was visible but did not sting. At the floor, it was freezing, a stagnant pool of chilled air that numbed the toes through the leather of the boots. He walked to the stove, his steps heavy on the wooden planks. Each footfall produced a dull thud, a sound that seemed to stop dead as soon as it was made, absorbed by the damp wood and the surrounding snow. The stove was the heart of the room, a cast-iron altar to combustion. He picked up the poker, a rod of blackened iron with a hooked end. He inserted it into the grate, feeling for the clinkers, the hard, stony residue of burnt coal that could choke the airflow. He moved the poker slowly, gently lifting the bed of coals to let the ash fall through to the pan below. The fire responded with a soft, settling sound, a shifting of weight as the fuel rearranged itself. Sparks rose in a lazy spiral, tiny constellations of orange that lived for a second before vanishing into the darkness of the flue. The heat from the open door of the stove washed over his shins and knees, a sharp, prickly sensation as the blood returned to the surface of the skin. He held his hands out, palms facing the glow. The skin of his hands was dry and papery, mapped with a network of fine lines that were ingrained with the dust of the coal and the graphite of the pencils. He rubbed his palms together, the sound dry and rasping, like two pieces of parchment sliding against each other. He watched the fire. It was a mesmerizing, primitive television, a constantly changing display of energy release. Blue flames licked at the fresh coal, jets of gas escaping from the black rock. Yellow flames danced in the center, consuming the carbon. Red embers pulsed at the bottom, the enduring heat storage of the system. He closed the stove door. The latch engaged with a solid metallic click. He adjusted the damper on the pipe, turning the spring handle a fraction of an inch to restrict the airflow. It was a delicate balance. Too much air and the coal burned too fast, wasting the supply. Too little and the fire would choke, the temperature dropping until the frost reclaimed the interior of the walls. He knew the stove's personality, its temperaments, and its needs. It was a companion, demanding but reliable. Returning to the desk, he sat down. The stool creaked, the wood complaining under the shift of weight. He looked at the ledger again. The ink of the last entry was now perfectly dry, a permanent record. Anton V. The name was just a sequence of shapes now, devoid of the man who bore it. The guard ran his finger down the column of dates. Yesterday, the day before, last week. The pages were a timeline of endurance. He turned back a few pages to the middle of the previous month. The entries were sparse. A week of heavy storms where no one had passed. The lines for those days were empty, save for the notation "pass closed blizzard" written in his own hand, spanning across the columns. The handwriting then was the same as it was now, steady, unemotional. He reached for the thermos again. He unscrewed the cup, the threads grinding slightly. He poured the last of the tea. It was tepid, dark, and thick with the sediment of the leaves. He drank it in one swallow, the the dregs gritty between his teeth. He placed the cup back on the thermos and screwed it down tight. The object felt solid, a cylinder of metal and glass that contained a vacuum, a small piece of nothingness designed to keep the heat in. He pushed it to the corner of the desk, aligning it with the edge of the blotter. On the wall next to the map of the sector hung a telephone. It was a large, boxy instrument made of black bakelite, its surface dull and scratched. The handset hung from a cradle on the side, connected by a thick, fabric-covered cord that was frayed in places, revealing the rubber insulation beneath. It was a direct line to the garrison in the valley, a thin wire that ran down the mountain, strung from pole to pole, coated in ice, swaying in the wind. It rarely rang. The connection was often down, severed by falling branches or the weight of the snow. The guard looked at the phone. It was a silent black object absorbing the light. He stood up and walked over to it. He did not expect a call. He simply needed to verify the existence of the line. He lifted the handset. The earpiece was cold against his ear, a hard circle of plastic. He listened. There was no dial tone. Instead, there was the sound of the storm itself, translated into electrical impulses. A hiss of static, like the sound of rain on a tin roof. A crackle of discharge. A low, oscillating hum that rose and fell with the wind speed outside. It was the voice of the wire, a long, frozen nerve stretching through the wilderness. He listened to the static for a minute, his eyes closed. It was a white noise, a chaotic, random signal that was strangely soothing. It confirmed that the wire was still intact, that it hadn't snapped under the tension. Somewhere miles away, the other end was connected to a switchboard, perhaps manned by another guard in another warm room, listening to the same static. It was a tenuous link, a fragile thread of copper binding the outpost to the rest of the grid. He replaced the handset. The cradle clicked. The connection was broken, or rather, the monitoring of it ceased. He walked back to the window. The frost on the glass had advanced. The clear patch he had wiped earlier was now hazing over, a thin film of gray crystals forming on the surface. He breathed on it, the warm air melting the ice instantly, creating a small, circular portal. He looked out. The world was darker now. The mist had not lifted, but the ambient light of the day had fully retreated, leaving only the reflection of the lantern on the snow to illuminate the immediate vicinity. The barrier gate was now just a suggestion of a line, a horizontal stroke of charcoal in the dark. The snow was piling up on top of it, a white ridge growing taller by the hour. If no one came to knock the snow off, the weight would eventually strain the counterweight mechanism. But he would not go out yet. It was not time. He watched the snowflakes fall into the pool of light. They were large aggregates now, clumps of crystals stuck together, falling straight down in the lee of the building. They looked like feathers, gray and soft, drifting endlessly from an infinite source. He thought about the geology of the pass. Beneath the snow, beneath the road, lay the rock, granite and slate, old and hard. It had been there before the border was drawn, before the road was paved, before the first human foot had stepped into the valley. It would be there long after the booth had rotted away and the ledger had turned to dust. The guard felt a strange comfort in this insignificance. He was not required to change the mountain. He was only required to witness it. His duty was not to the land, but to the line on the map, a conceptual abstraction that required constant affirmation to exist. He returned to the stool. He picked up a pencil this time, a simple wooden pencil with the paint worn off near the tip. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the hexagonal shape. He found a scrap of paper, a corner torn from an old shipping manifest, and began to sharpen the pencil with a small pocket knife. He pared away the wood in thin, curled shavings that fell onto the desk. The smell of the fresh cedar was sharp and clean, a sudden burst of organic scent in the stale room. He exposed the graphite core, shaving it to a fine, deadly point. The sound of the blade on the wood was rhythmic. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He blew the shavings into his hand and walked to the stove, tossing them into the ash pan. They flared up instantly, tiny curls of yellow fire that consumed themselves in a second. He sat back down and tested the point of the pencil on the scrap paper. He drew a line, a circle, a series of parallel hatches. The graphite was soft, leaving a dark, lustrous mark. He was satisfied. He placed the pencil next to the pen, parallel, aligned. The wind outside shifted again, dropping in pitch to a low rumble that vibrated the window pane in its frame. The glass rattled, a nervous, chattering sound. The guard did not look up. He was accustomed to the building's complaints. It was an old structure settling into the permafrost, shifting with the freeze and thaw cycles of the seasons. The timbers groaned occasionally, snapping with the tension of the cold. These were the sounds of the house stretching, adjusting its bones to the weight of the winter. He looked at the lantern. The oil reservoir was still half full, the golden liquid visible through the glass base. The wick was burning evenly, a small blue triangle at the base of the flame, transitioning to yellow and then to a smoky orange at the tip. The glass chimney was stained with soot at the top, a gradient of black that blocked the light from hitting the ceiling directly. He should clean it, he thought, tomorrow, or the next day, when the light of the day was strong enough to work by without the lamp. For now, the soot was a filter, softening the light, making the shadows deeper, more velvety. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to have mass. They were not just the absence of light, they were a presence, a heavy, dark substance that pooled on the floor and climbed the walls. They hid the details of the carpentry, the cobwebs in the rafters, the dust on the shelves. They made the room feel smaller, more intimate. The guard felt wrapped in them, swaddled in the darkness. The circle of light from the lamp was his territory, the only part of the universe that he could see clearly. Beyond that circle lay the unknown, the mist, the mountains, the night. He checked the time. The clock ticked on, tick, tick, tick. The hands had moved, but the progress seemed negligible. The angle between the hour and minute hands had widened slightly, a geometric shift that meant 20 minutes had passed, or perhaps 30. Time in the booth was elastic. It stretched during the long periods of silence and snapped shut during the brief moments of activity. Now it was stretching. A long, thin band of duration that extended out into the future. He felt the fatigue of the posture. Sitting was work. Keeping the spine straight, the head up, the eyes open. It was a low-level exertion that burned calories slowly. He shifted his weight, crossing his left leg over his right. The wool of his trousers pulled tight against his knee. He felt the rough texture of the fabric against his skin. It was a uniform of discomfort, designed for durability rather than ease. It was a reminder of his station. He looked at the shelf above the desk. There were a few books there, leaning against each other. A manual of regulations, thick and bound in red leatherette. A book of codes, its cover torn. A novel he had read 3 times, its pages swollen with dampness, the story of a sailor in the southern oceans. He did not reach for them. Reading required a different kind of focus, a departure from the present. Tonight, he preferred to stay here in the booth in the mist. He preferred the text of the room itself. He listened to his own breathing, in slow and shallow, out a soft sigh through the nose. The rhythm of his life was synced with the slow pulse of the stove. He was a metabolic engine, consuming oxygen and producing heat, just like the fire. He was a biological component of the checkpoint. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the darkness behind his eyelids merge with the darkness of the room. He could see the afterimage of the lantern flame, a bright purple spot floating in the black. He opened his eyes. The room was the same. The wood, the glass, the iron, the mist pressing against the window, the silence waiting to be broken. He was ready. He was always ready. But for now there was nothing. Only the cold seeping through the walls, seeking the center of the warmth. He pulled his hands into the sleeves of his coat, creating a muff of wool. He stared at the flame, and the flame stared back, a single unblinking eye in the night. The wind picked up a handful of loose snow from the roof and threw it down past the window. It fell like a curtain, a white blur that obscured the darkness for a split second. Then it was gone. The guard did not blink. He watched the space where the snow had been. He watched the empty road. He watched the mist. And the mist watched him, a gray, indifferent observer pressing its face against the glass, breathing its cold breath onto the world. The equilibrium of the room had settled into a state of deep, resonant stillness, a silence that felt less like the absence of noise, and more like a heavy, unseen substance filling the volume of the booth. The air was stratified, layers of heat and cold pressing against one another in invisible conflict. Near the ceiling, where the shadows gathered in the corners of the rough-hewn beams, the air was thick and warm, carrying the dry, dusty scent of the heated wood. Lower down, near the floorboards where the draft whistled through the gaps in the joinery, the air was sharp and biting, a fluid that seemed to carry the weight of the glaciers that hung in the darkness above. The guard sat at the interface of these two climates, his upper body wrapped in the tepid comfort of the stove's radiation, his legs encased in the subterranean chill that rose from the earth. He shifted his weight on the high stool, the wood groaning with a low, dry complaint that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the insulation of the snow outside. It was time for the ritual of sustenance. It was not a meal born of appetite, for the cold suppressed hunger, slowing the metabolism to a crawl. It was a maintenance task, a necessary input of fuel to keep the biological engine turning. He reached down into the heavy canvas satchel that rested against the leg of the desk. The fabric was stiff, cold to the touch, the buckle made of brass that had tarnished to the color of old pennies. He unfastened the strap, the metal tongue sliding through the leather loop with a faint scrape. He withdrew a parcel wrapped in brown butcher paper. The paper was crinkled, bearing the creases of having been folded and unfolded, a map of consumption. He placed it on the desk, moving the ink pad and the stamp slightly to the side to create a clean surface. He unfolded the paper slowly, smoothing out the corners with the side of his hand. Inside lay a block of dark, dense bread and a wedge of hard cheese. The bread was coarse, a brick of rye and molasses that was heavy in the hand. The cheese was pale and dry, a product of a summer long past, preserved by salt and time. He took a small pocket knife from his coat, the blade worn thin from years of sharpening. He cut a slice of the cheese. The knife required pressure to pass through the hardened curd, the blade slipping once before biting in. He placed the sliver of cheese on a piece of the bread. He ate. The act of chewing was loud in the silence. The crust of the bread shattered against his teeth, a dry, crunching sound that seemed to originate from the center of his skull. The texture was fibrous, demanding effort. He chewed slowly, methodically, grinding the grain and the curd into a paste that could be swallowed. He stared at the lantern flame as he ate, watching the way the draft made the fire dance, a hypnotic, rhythmic flickering that pulsed in time with his jaw. There was no rush. The night stretched out before him, a vast, dark continent of time that had to be crossed minute by minute. He brushed the crumbs from the desk into his hand, feeling the rough, granular texture of the rye against his palm. He stood up and walked to the stove, opening the door with the familiar screech of the hinges. He threw the crumbs into the fire. They flared instantly, tiny sparks of organic matter returning to carbon, vanishing in a breath of yellow light. He watched them disappear, a microscopic event in the thermal history of the room. While standing, he turned his attention to the shelves that lined the back wall of the booth. They were simple planks of pine, stained dark and sagging slightly under the weight of their burden. They held the archive of the checkpoint. Rows of ledgers, identical to the one open on his desk, stood spine to spine, a library of boredom. They were bound in various shades of canvas, faded greens, dull blues, and grays that matched the sky outside. Some were thick, swollen with humidity. Others were thin, their covers warping outward. They contained the names of everyone who had passed this way for the last 40 years. He reached out and touched the spine of a volume near the end of the row. The canvas was cold and rough, like the skin of a dormant reptile. Dust coated the top edge of the book, a fine gray powder that had settled there over months of stillness. He pulled the book from the shelf. It slid out with a dry hiss of friction, resisting the movement as if it had become fused to its neighbors. He carried it to the desk and placed it under the light of the lantern. The cover was a mottled gray, stained with rings where mugs of tea had been placed decades ago. He opened it at random. The binding cracked, the glue having crystallized into brittle amber shards. The pages were yellowed, the paper distinctively different from the current stock, thicker, with a higher rag content. The ink was brown, fading to sepia. He read the date at the top of the page, November 14th, 1952, 30 years ago. He scanned the entries. 0400 supply truck northbound, driver K. Miller, cargo timber. 0630 mail carrier southbound on foot. 1100 private vehicle. Engine trouble, delayed. The handwriting was looped and ornate, a script taught in schools that had since been reformed. The guard traced the letters with his eyes, imagining the hand that wrote them. A different hand, a different guard, sitting on perhaps the same stool, warming his hands at a different stove. The weather noted in the margin was the same. Heavy fog, visibility near zero, temp. It was a confirmation of continuity. The names changed, the vehicles evolved from horse-drawn carts to diesel trucks. The uniforms were cut from different cloth, but the essential experience of the checkpoint remained absolute. The cold, the mist, the waiting. The guard felt a strange kinship with this ghost from the past, a silent brotherhood of the watch. He turned the page. More names, more times, more stamps. A record of human movement that amounted to nothing but a list in a cold room. He closed the old ledger. The sound of the heavy cover falling shut was a dull thud, a punctuation mark in the quiet. He carried it back to the shelf and slid it into its gap. He pushed it in until the spine was flush with the others, restoring the order of the archive. The dust settled back into the air, invisible motes dancing in the periphery of the lantern light. He walked to the window again. The frost had advanced significantly. The clear portal he had melted with his breath was gone, overgrown by a new forest of ice crystals. These were thicker, more opaque, forming a barrier that was almost geological in its complexity. He did not clear it this time. He let the barrier stand. The world outside had ceased to matter for the moment. The mist was doing its work, sealing the pass, turning the outpost into a capsule adrift in the white. He looked at the thermometer mounted on the external frame of the window, pressing his face close to the glass to read the scale through a patch of thinner ice. The red spirit in the tube had retreated deep into the bulb. It was colder than before. The temperature was falling with the inexorable gravity of the night. He could feel the cold radiating through the glass, a physical presence that pushed against his face. He stepped back, rubbing his nose where the chill had bitten. The wind had changed its voice. It was no longer a whistle, but a deep, throaty rumble that shook the eaves of the roof. It sounded like the breathing of a large animal sleeping just outside the walls. The structure of the booth creaked in response, the timber contracting as the temperature plummeted. A nail popped somewhere in the ceiling, a sharp, sudden crack that sounded like a pistol shot. The guard did not flinch. He knew these sounds. They were the language of the building, a conversation between the wood and the weather. He returned to the desk and sat. He picked up the fountain pen. The black barrel was cool and smooth. He unscrewed the cap and checked the nib. It was wet with ink, a small bead of black liquid poised at the tip. He held it over the blotting paper, watching the bead. It trembled slightly with the vibration of the wind. He did not write. There was nothing to write. The last entry, Anton V., stood alone on the page, a solitary testament to the night's activity. He looked at the oil lamp. The flame was burning a little lower now, the wick having consumed the available fuel in the weave. He reached for the adjustment wheel, a small brass knob at the base of the burner. He turned it slowly, clockwise. The wick rose, exposing fresh, oil-soaked cotton to the heat. The flame grew, brightening from a dull orange to a lucid yellow. The shadows in the room retreated, shrinking back into the corners. The light revealed the texture of the desk surface, the scratches, the dents, the grain of the oak. It highlighted the dust on the floor, the soot on the stovepipe. The smell of the kerosene became stronger with the larger flame. It was a chemical scent, pungent and oily, but to the guard, it was the smell of safety. It was the smell of civilization holding back the raw, odorless cold of the mountain. He inhaled it deeply, letting the fumes coat the back of his throat. He checked the coal bucket. It was half empty. He would need to refill it from the bunker outside before the end of the shift. The thought of going outside, of leaving the thermal envelope of the booth, was unpleasant. It would require preparation. Gloves, scarf, the bracing of the spirit. He pushed the thought away. There was still enough coal for a few hours. He would wait. He picked up the stamp again. He held it up to the light, examining the rubber die. Dust and fibers from the paper had accumulated in the crevices of the letters. He opened a drawer in the desk and took out a small, stiff brush. He began to clean the stamp, brushing the rubber with short, flicking motions. The dust fell away, leaving the purple-stained rubber clean and sharp. He brushed the eagle, the shield, the letters. Border Post 39. He was tending to the tools of his trade, maintaining the instruments of bureaucracy. He placed the stamp back on the desk, aligned with the ink pad. He put the brush back in the drawer. He closed the drawer. Click. Every action was distinct, separated from the next by a pause of silence. There was no flow, only a sequence of discrete events. He leaned back on the stool, resting his heels on the rung. He clasped his hands in his lap. He listened. The silence of the room was a canvas on which the smallest sounds were painted in high definition. The ticking of the clock, tick, 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 the hiss of the lamp, SSSHHH, the settling of the coal, crunch, the wind, woo. It was a symphony of minimalism, a composition of attrition. He stared at the window again. The frost was now so thick that the lantern light reflected back at him, creating a mirror effect. He saw his own face in the glass, a ghostly, distorted portrait sketched in yellow light and gray ice. His eyes were dark hollows, his skin pale, his hat a shapeless mass of shadow. He looked like a part of the booth, a fixture that had grown out of the wood. He did not recognize himself as a separate entity. He was merely the consciousness of the room. He thought about the pass in summer, the green of the pines, the rush of the meltwater in the streams, the dust of the road. It seemed like a different planet, a memory from a dream. The reality was this: The white, the gray, the black, the cold that stopped time. The summer was a lie, winter was the truth. He looked at his hands. The fingernails were short, clean, the cuticles dry. The skin on the back of his hands was thin, the veins blue and prominent. He flexed his fingers, watching the tendons move under the skin. It was a small mechanical action, a proof of life. He was still here. He was still functioning. The phone on the wall remained silent. The black bakelite absorbed the dim light, offering no reflection. It hung like a dead weight, a relic of communication. The guard did not check it again. The static was there, he knew, the white noise of the wire. It was enough to know it existed. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the wind wash over him. In the darkness of his mind, he saw the road stretching out, a ribbon of white winding through the black trees. He saw the snowflakes falling on the empty tarmac, piling up, covering the stones. He saw the world sleeping under the blanket of the mist. He felt the rotation of the earth, a slow, heavy turn into the depths of the night. When he opened his eyes, nothing had changed. The room was the same. The light was the same. The cold was the same. He was the same. He took a deep breath, the air cool in his nostrils. He was the anchor. He was the weight that held the border in place. He reached for the ledger one more time, smoothing the page with his palm. The paper was cool and smooth. He was waiting for the next line to be written. He was waiting for the mist to part again. But for now, there was only the wait. The decision to leave the sanctuary of the booth was not made lightly. It was a calculation of resources against comfort, a necessary transaction with the elements. The coal bucket, standing in the shadow of the stove, was now more void than substance, holding only a layer of black dust and a few small, unburnable shards of slate. To maintain the thermal equilibrium of the room, to keep the frost from colonizing the interior walls, the reserve had to be replenished. The guard stared at the empty bucket for a long moment, acknowledging the task. It was a disruption of the stillness, a requirement for movement that the body, settled into the lethargy of the warmth, resisted. He began the preparation. It was a ritual of armoring, a layering of defenses against the hostility of the pass. He stood up, the joints of his knees popping in the quiet. He walked to the hooks on the wall where the heavy outer garments hung like the pelts of large, dark animals. He reached for his scarf first. It was a long strip of coarse, gray wool, knitted by hand, the stitches tight and uneven. It smelled of wet sheep and camphor. He wound it around his neck, tucking the ends deep into the collar of his tunic. The wool scratched against his skin, a familiar irritation that signaled the transition to the exterior. Next, the gloves. They were massive, gauntleted mittens made of stiff leather, lined with fur that had matted down over years of use. They lay on the shelf above the hooks, their palms curved inward as if still gripping an invisible handle. He pulled them on, working his fingers into the cold interior. The leather creaked, resisting the expansion of his hands. He flexed his fists, feeling the stiffness of the material. With the gloves on, his hands were transformed into clumsy paws, devoid of dexterity, but insulated against the bite of the metal bucket handle. He picked up the bucket. It was galvanized steel, battered and dented, the zinc coating worn away in patches to reveal the dark iron beneath. The handle was a thin wire bale with a wooden grip that had split down the middle. It rattled against the rim as he lifted it, a hollow, tinny sound. He walked to the door. He paused, his hand hovering over the latch. He could hear the wind on the other side, a continuous, rushing presence that pressed against the wood. He took a breath, bracing his internal temperature against the shock to come. He threw the latch. The metal was cold enough to burn, even through the leather of the glove. He pushed the door open. The wind did not enter. It assaulted. It was a physical force, a wall of freezing air that slammed into him, stripping the warmth from his face and the front of his coat in a single second. The door was ripped from his grip, swinging wide and hitting the external stop with a violent crash. The atmosphere of the booth was instantly evacuated, replaced by the chaotic, swirling draft of the mountain. Papers on the desk fluttered in a sudden panic, the pages of the ledger lifting and falling like the wings of a trapped bird. The lantern flame danced wildly, threatening to extinguish, sending frantic, spasmodic shadows leaping across the ceiling. The guard stepped out. He pulled the door shut behind him, leaning his weight against it to engage the latch against the pressure of the wind. The click was swallowed by the roar of the gale. He was outside. The world had vanished. There was no landscape, no horizon, no sky. There was only the mist and the night, fused into a single, impenetrable substance. The light from the window of the booth cast a pale, rectangular beam onto the snow, illuminating a swirl of falling flakes that looked like white sparks in the darkness. Beyond that beam, the visibility was zero. The air was thick with ice crystals, a suspended ocean of frozen water that stung the skin and coated the eyelashes instantly. The cold was absolute. It was not merely a low temperature. It was an active, predatory presence that sought to drain the heat from every living cell. He walked towards the coal bunker, a low wooden structure built against the side of the booth. His boots sank into the fresh drift, the snow crunching loudly with a dry, squeaking sound that is unique to extreme cold. The wind howled around the corner of the building, tearing at his coat, seeking the gaps in his scarf. He kept his head down, burying his chin in the wool, narrowing his eyes to slits to protect them from the stinging ice. The bunker was only 5 paces away, but the journey felt significant. It was a traverse across a hostile planet. The wood of the bunker was black with creosote, preserved against the rot of the damp summers. The lid was heavy, made of thick planks, and covered with a sheet of galvanized iron that was now buried under a foot of snow. He reached out with his gloved hand and swept the snow away, his arm moving in a wide, heavy arc. The snow was light and powdery, flying off into the wind like smoke. He lifted the lid. It was heavy, frozen to the frame. He had to jerk it upward, breaking the seal of ice. It opened with a groan of frozen hinges. Inside, the darkness was complete. He could smell the coal, a sharp, sulfuric scent that cut through the clean smell of the snow. It was the smell of the deep earth, of ancient forests compressed into rock. He reached in with the small iron shovel that hung on a nail inside the bunker. He scraped the shovel against the pile. Scrape, crunch, rattle. The sounds were magnified in the small, wooden echo chamber of the bunker. He filled the shovel, the coal lumps tumbling over each other, hard and heavy. He poured the load into the bucket. The sound of the coal hitting the metal bottom was a harsh, crashing noise, a sudden violence in the muffled world of the snow. He repeated the motion: scrape, lift, pour. The dust rose up, invisible in the dark but palpable in the nose and throat, mixing with the ice crystals. He worked methodically. The cold was seeping through his boots now, finding the toes. The wind was relentless, buffeting his back, pushing him against the bunker. He filled the bucket to the brim, piling the black lumps high. It was a heavy load, a concentrated mass of potential heat. He placed the shovel back on its nail. He lowered the lid of the bunker, letting it slam shut. The sound was dull, final. He brushed the fresh snow from the top of the lid, a futile gesture of order. He picked up the bucket. The wire handle dug into his palm through the glove. The weight pulled at his shoulder. He turned back towards the booth. The window was a beacon, a warm yellow square floating in the gray void. He could see the interior through the glass, the desk, the lamp, the empty stool. It looked like a stage set, a diorama of comfort separated from him by a few feet of frozen air and a pane of glass. He walked back, retracing his own footprints which were already filling with snow. The wind was in his face now, pushing him back, resisting his return. He lowered his head and pushed forward, a dark shape moving through the white noise. He reached the door. He had to set the bucket down in the snow to free a hand for the latch. He fumbled with the cold metal, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He pressed his thumb against the lever. It gave way. He picked up the bucket and pushed the door open. He stepped inside, dragging the heavy pail over the threshold. He kicked the door shut with his heel, leaning back against it to ensure the latch caught. Click. The silence returned. The wind was instantly relegated to the background, a distant roaring that could no longer touch him. The air in the booth was still churning from the intrusion, cool currents mixing with the warm, but the core heat remained. The lantern flame steadied, rising back to a vertical tongue of fire. The papers on the desk settled. The guard stood for a moment, breathing heavily. The air in the room felt thick and rich compared to the thin, icy atmosphere outside. He could smell the ozone on his clothes, the fresh scent of the snow clinging to his wool coat. He looked down at the bucket. It was full, a mound of black gold glistening with melted snow where the flakes had landed on the coal. He carried the bucket to the stove and set it down on the brick hearth. The metal clanged against the masonry. He began the process of shedding the armor. He pulled off the heavy gloves, one finger at a time, revealing hands that were pale and cold. He rubbed them together, feeling the friction generate a small spark of warmth. He unwound the scarf, the wool damp with condensation from his breath. He hung it on the hook. He took off his hat, shaking the snow from the brim. The flakes fell to the floor and melted instantly, leaving small, dark spots on the wood. He unbuttoned his coat. The buttons were cold, difficult to manipulate. He opened the coat but did not take it off. He needed to retain the body heat he had generated. He walked to the stove and held his hands over the top plate. The heat was intense, a solid block of radiation that thawed the skin. He felt the blood returning to his fingertips, a prickly, painful sensation known as the screaming barfies in the vernacular of the climbers, though here it was just the daily throb of recovery. He looked at the window. The view was unchanged. The mist, the frost, the darkness, but he had ventured out into it and returned. He had secured the fuel. The night could continue. He picked up the poker and opened the stove door. The fire had burned down to a low bed of glowing embers, a deep, pulsing red. He used the tongs to select a large lump of coal from the fresh supply. He placed it carefully into the center of the heat. He added another and then a third. He arranged them to allow for airflow, building a small cairn of carbon. He watched as the heat attacked the cold, black surfaces. Moisture sizzled and evaporated. Tiny jets of gas ignited. The transformation began. He closed the door and adjusted the damper. The stove began to tick and ping as the metal expanded with the rising heat. It was a comforting sound, the sound of a machine working correctly. He returned to the desk and sat down. The stool felt familiar, molded to his shape. He checked the time. The excursion had taken only 10 minutes, but it felt like an hour. The clock read half past the hour. The night was a slow river, and he was drifting in the middle of it. He looked at the ledger. The paper was still ruffled from the draft. He smoothed it down with his hand. The ink of the previous entries was unaffected. The history was safe. He picked up the pen just to hold it, to feel the balance of a tool that required delicacy rather than force. His eyes wandered to the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. There was a spider web there, high up near the ceiling beam. It was old, covered in dust, draped like a gray hammock. The spider was long gone or dead, a dried husk in the center of its creation. The web trembled slightly in the rising heat from the stove. It was a piece of architecture as fragile as the frost on the window, yet it endured in the stillness of the booth. The guard felt a heaviness in his limbs, the aftermath of the cold exposure. His muscles relaxed, surrendering to the warmth. His eyelids felt heavy. He blinked slowly, clearing the image of the snow from his retinas. The image of the swirling white flakes persisted for a moment, a ghostly afterimage superimposed on the dark wood of the desk. He reached for the thermos again, shaking it. It was empty. He had drunk the last of the tea. The realization was a small disappointment, a minor tragedy of supply. He set it back down. He would have to melt snow if he wanted water, but the stove was busy heating the room. He would wait. Thirst was a manageable sensation. He listened to the wind. It seemed to have found a new rhythm, a steady, pulsing beat that pushed against the walls in waves. Whoosh, silence, whoosh, silence. It was hypnotic. It sounded like the breathing of the mountain itself, vast and slow. The booth was a small lung inside the chest of a giant, expanding and contracting with the thermal tides. He looked at the map on the wall. It was a topographic map, the contour lines swirling in tight, concentric circles to represent the peaks. The paper was yellow and brittle. A red line marked the border, a jagged scar running across the paper terrain. He traced the line with his eyes. It went over glaciers, down precipices, across frozen lakes. It was an impossible line, a fiction imposed on the geography. Yet he was here to defend it, to watch it, to stamp the papers that acknowledged it. He thought about the concept of the border. It was a place where things stopped, where laws changed, where one reality ended and another began. But in the mist there was no border. There was only the gray. The mist did not respect the line. The wind did not show a passport. The snow did not pay a tariff. The natural world was borderless, a single, flowing continuum of energy and matter. The booth was the anomaly. He looked at the stamp, the brass handle, the wooden grip. It was the instrument of division. He picked it up and pressed it onto a scrap of paper just to see the mark. Border Post 39. The ink was violet, the color of bruises, the color of twilight. He looked at the mark. It was a small circle of authority. It meant you may pass. But pass into what? Into the mist, into the cold. He wiped the stamp with a cloth and set it down. He was tired. The cold had leached some of his vitality. He rested his head in his hands, his elbows on the desk. He closed his eyes. He listened to the fire. The coal was catching now, burning with a steady, low roar. It was the sound of survival. He drifted in a half-sleep, a state of suspended awareness where the sounds of the room were amplified. The ticking of the clock became the footsteps of a giant. The hiss of the lamp became the sound of a waterfall. The wind became a choir of voices singing in a language he did not understand. Then a sound snapped him back, a sharp crack from the ice on the roof. He sat up, alert. He looked at the window. The frost was a thick curtain now. He could see nothing, but he sensed something, a change in the pressure, a presence. He stood up and walked to the window. He put his hand against the glass. He felt the vibration of the wind. But underneath that was there something else, a rhythm, a tread. He waited. He held his breath. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20. Then a faint sound, clink. Metal on stone or ice on ice. It was distant, muffled by the fog, but it was there. Someone was out there. Someone was walking in the mist. He turned to the door. He did not open it. He waited. He checked the latch. He walked back to the desk and stood behind it. He assumed the posture of the official. He was ready. The sound came again. Closer, crunch, the sound of a boot on snow, slow, heavy, struggling. The guard watched the door. He watched the handle. He waited for the knock. The mist had delivered another traveler. The knock, when it finally came, was not a demand for entry but a plea. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping against the heavy wood of the door, lacking the sharpness of knuckles on timber. It sounded more like the impact of a gloved fist, or perhaps a shoulder, weary and stripped of force by the journey through the drifts. The sound did not echo. It was absorbed instantly by the thick atmosphere of the room and the insulating layers of snow outside. Thump, thump, thump. 3 beats spaced unevenly, speaking of exhaustion rather than authority. The guard did not move immediately. His training and the instinct developed over countless nights of solitude required a pause. He stood behind the desk, his hands resting on the cool surface of the ledger, his silhouette framed by the amber light of the lantern. He listened to the wind howling around the eaves, a counterpoint to the human sound at the door. He watched the latch. It was a heavy iron mechanism, currently engaged, a physical barrier between the warmth of the state and the chaos of the storm. He walked to the door, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He did not ask, "Who is it?" The wind would tear the words away before they could be heard. Instead, he placed his hand on the cold iron of the bolt. He could feel the vibration of the wind on the other side, a trembling energy that sought release. He slid the bolt back. The metal groaned, a screech of friction that seemed loud in the small space. He pressed down on the latch and pushed. The door did not swing open easily. It was held by the pressure of the wind and a buildup of drift ice at the base. He had to lean his shoulder into it, shoving hard against the resistance. The wood cracked, the ice seal breaking with a sharp snap. The door swung inward, bringing with it a swirl of snow and a blast of freezing air that instantly dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. The lantern flame flared wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls like panicked spirits. A figure stood in the opening. It was less a person than a sculpture of ice and wool. The traveler was wrapped in a long, dark coat that was stiff with frozen moisture. A heavy scarf covered the lower half of the face, encrusted with icicles where the breath had condensed and frozen. A fur hat was pulled low, the fibers matted with snow. The figure was bent forward, leaning into the wind, carrying a nondescript rucksack that looked heavy and wet. The guard stepped back, motioning with a curt nod for the traveler to enter. The figure stumbled across the threshold, boots slipping on the wet floorboards, and brought the storm inside with him. The guard immediately threw his weight against the door, fighting the wind to close it. He slammed the bolt home with a satisfying clank. The roar of the wind was instantly muted, replaced by the heavy breathing of the newcomer and the hiss of the recovering lantern. The traveler stood in the center of the room, dripping. Water began to pool around his boots as the warmth of the stove attacked the ice on his coat. He did not speak. He raised a hand, encased in a thick, wet mitten, and slowly pulled the scarf down from his face. The skin underneath was raw and red, wind-burned to the color of raw meat. His lips were pale and cracked. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with deep lines etched into his face that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His eyes were watery and bloodshot, blinking rapidly in the sudden light. "Papers," the guard said. His voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. It was not cruelty, but economy. Words were energy, emotion was heat. Both were to be conserved. The traveler nodded slowly, a jerky movement of a neck stiffened by cold. He fumbled with the buttons of his coat. His fingers were clumsy, numb. It took him a long time to undo the top 3 buttons. He reached inside into the deeper layers of his clothing and pulled out a plastic pouch. He handed it to the guard. The guard took the pouch. It was warm from the traveler's body heat. He walked back to the desk, leaving the man standing in the puddle of meltwater. He sat down and opened the pouch. Inside was a passport, dry and pristine. He removed it. The cover was dark green, the gold lettering crisp. Republic of. The name was of a southern state, a place of vineyards and warm coasts. The contrast with the reality of the past was jarring. He opened the book. The photo showed the man in a suit, clean-shaven, looking serious but healthy. Elia's profession, clockmaker. The guard looked up at the man, then back at the photo. The eyes were the same. The structure of the face was the same. But the man in the room was a ruined version of the man in the book, eroded by the elements. The guard picked up his magnifying glass. He examined the visa page. There was a transit stamp from the valley below, dated 2 days ago, valid for 72 hours. The man was cutting it close. The weather had likely delayed him. The guard checked the security thread in the paper, holding the page up to the lantern. A thin, dark line ran through the fibers, visible only with backlighting. It was genuine. Purpose of travel? The guard asked, not looking up. Delivery, the traveler rasped. His voice was a dry croak, barely audible. To the monastery up north. The guard paused. The monastery was another 20 miles through the pass on the other side of the ridge. In this weather on foot, it was a death sentence. But that was not the guard's concern. His concern was the border. Cargo. The traveler pointed to the rucksack. Parts, springs, gears for the tower clock. The guard looked at the bag. It sat on the floor, wet and dark. He stood up and walked around the desk. Open it. The traveler knelt, his knees cracking. He unbuckled the straps of the rucksack. The leather was sodden. He pulled open the drawstring. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and wool, were small wooden boxes. He opened one. It contained a brass escapement wheel, the teeth gleaming in the lantern light. It was a beautiful, precise object, utterly out of place in the rough wooden booth. The guard looked at the wheel. He nodded. Close it. He returned to the desk. He sat down and picked up the stamp. He inked it. Thump. He pressed it onto the passport. The violet circle appeared on the page, stark and official. Border Post 39. Transit approved. He wrote the details in the ledger. Elia's clockmaker, south to north, foot traffic. He noted the time. It was deep into the night now. The pen scratched loudly. He held the passport out. The traveler stood up, leaving the bag on the floor for a moment, and took the book. He placed it back in the plastic pouch, sealing it carefully, and returned it to the sanctuary of his coat. The storm, the traveler said, his voice gaining a little strength. Is it? Does it break soon? The guard looked at the window. The frost was solid. The wind was a constant drone. No, he said, it settles. The traveler nodded, a gesture of resignation. He knew. He had walked through it. He bent down and picked up his rucksack, shouldering the weight. He adjusted his scarf, pulling it back up over his face, hiding the red skin and the cracked lips. He pulled his hat down tight. He was armoring himself again. You can warm yourself, the guard said, gesturing to the stove. It was an offer, not a command. A concession to the shared humanity of the species, allowed within the regulations. The traveler looked at the stove. The iron radiated heat, a palpable wave of comfort. He hesitated. To To stop now, to let the warmth seep into the bones, would make leaving harder. It would soften the resolve. He shook his head. "If I stop, I will not start again," he mumbled through the wool. The guard understood. Momentum was everything. Inertia was the enemy. The traveler turned to the door. He placed his hand on the latch. He looked back at the guard for a second. There was a look in his eyes, not gratitude but acknowledgement, a recognition of the role each played, the watcher and the walker. "Go," the guard said. The traveler opened the door. The wind screamed again, rushing into the room, tearing at the papers, flickering the light. The cold bit instantly. The traveler stepped out into the maelstrom. The door slammed shut. The bolt was thrown. Clank. The silence returned, but it was different now. The floor was wet. There was a puddle of water where the traveler had stood, a dark, reflective mirror on the wood. The air smelled of wet wool and ozone. The guard looked at the puddle. It was the only evidence that anyone had been there. He walked to the mop that stood in the corner. It was a gray, stringy thing, dry as bone. He dipped it into the bucket of water he kept for cleaning. He wrung it out. He mopped the floor. The water was absorbed, the wood darkening further. He worked methodically, erasing the footprints, erasing the pool. Within minutes, the floor was damp but clean. The evidence was gone. He sat back down. He looked at the ledger. The entry was there. Elia's M. It was the only proof. He felt a chill. The brief opening of the door had exchanged a significant volume of warm air for cold. The temperature in the booth had dropped. He could feel it in his fingers. He rubbed them together. He looked at the stove. It needed fuel. He got up and added coal. The fire roared, grateful for the offering. He stood by the stove for a long time, soaking in the heat, trying to drive the memory of the wind out of his clothes. He thought about the clockmaker, walking into the dark, carrying brass wheels and steel springs to a monastery that might be buried in snow. It was a futile gesture. The time in the mountains was measured in eras, not seconds. A clock was a vanity. But the guard respected the duty. The man had a task. He was fulfilling it, just as the guard had a task. He went back to the window. He scraped a small hole in the frost with his fingernail. Scritch, scritch. He looked out. There was nothing. No light. No movement. Just the swirling chaos of the storm. The clockmaker was already gone, swallowed by the white wail of the winter. The guard sat down. He was alone again. The solitude felt deeper now, more profound. He was the only conscious point in a universe of unconscious matter. He picked up the pen. He held it. He waited. The clock on the wall ticked. Tick, tick, tick. It was a mechanical sound, a human sound. It was the sound of order. The guard listened to it. It was his companion. He opened the drawer and took out a small tin of tobacco. He didn't smoke often, but tonight felt heavy. He rolled a thin cigarette, his fingers deft and precise. He lit it with a match from a box on the desk. The sulfur flared, then the sweet smell of the tobacco filled the air, masking the smell of the coal and the ozone. He took a drag. The smoke curled up, blue and gray, drifting into the shadows of the ceiling. He watched the smoke. It moved like the mist outside, swirling, changing shape, dissipating. It was a microcosm of the weather. He finished the cigarette and crushed it out in a small brass ashtray. He cleaned the ashtray immediately, wiping the ash into the bin. Order, cleanliness. He looked at the map. The monastery was a tiny cross on the paper, high up in the peaks. He traced the route with his finger, along the ridge, down into the ravine, up the glacier. It was a hard road. He wondered if the clockmaker would make it. He wondered if the clock would ever tick again. It didn't matter, the stamp was given. The gate was opened, his part was done. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The wind sang its song, a mournful, high-pitched wail that rose and fell. It was the song of the high places, the song of the empty spaces. He let his mind drift. He imagined the spring, the melting of the ice, the sound of water running in the gutters, the green shoots pushing up through the mud. It seemed impossible, a fantasy. The world was ice. The world was white. He opened his eyes. The room was steady. The light was gold. The book was open. He was the guard. He was the post. He was the border, and he waited. The smoke from the cigarette had long since dissipated, drawn up into the draft of the chimney, or settled as a microscopic film of ash upon the floorboards, leaving the air in the booth once again dominated by the twin scents of iron and ozone. The departure of the clockmaker, Elias, had been an event of singular disruption, a tear in the fabric of the night that had now been stitched shut by the relentless continuity of the routine. The puddle of meltwater he had left behind was gone, evaporated by the dry heat of the stove or absorbed into the thirsty grain of the wood, leaving only a faint, dark stain that would fade with the coming dawn. The silence that filled the space was not the empty silence of before. It was a denser, more solidified silence, compacted by the knowledge that the only other living soul within 20 miles was now fighting for his life in the dark, while the guard sat in a box of yellow light, observing the static of the room. He turned his gaze to the window. The frost had conquered the glass completely. Where before there had been patches of transparency or thin rime, there was now a thick, opaque armor of ice. It was not merely a coating. It was a geological formation, a vertical glacier that had accreted layer by layer over the hours. The crystals were large and complex, forming fern-like patterns that interlocked with the precision of a master craftsman. Ridges of ice stood out in relief, catching the light of the lantern and refracting it into dull prisms of indigo and charcoal. The outside world, the road, the gate, the trees, the mist, was no longer visible. The booth had become a capsule, sealed off from the universe by a wall of frozen water. The guard did not attempt to clear a viewport. To do so would be to invite the gaze of the storm, to acknowledge the hostility of the void. He preferred the isolation. It was safer. He shifted on the stool, the wood protesting with a low, rhythmic creak that seemed to harmonize with the wind. The temperature in the room was fluctuating. The stove, fueled by the fresh coal, was putting out a steady, throbbing heat, but the cold was pressing back with renewed vigor. He could feel the thermal gradient in the air, a physical boundary where the warm convection currents met the frigid radiation from the walls. He sat in the middle, his face warm, his back cool, suspended in the thermal tension of the shelter. He pulled his coat tighter around him, the rough wool buttoned to the chin. The fabric was a second skin, a layer of insulation that separated the biological from the environmental. He looked at the map on the wall. It was pinned to the corkboard with 4 brass tacks, the corners curling inward. The paper was old, yellowed to the color of parchment and brittle with age. It depicted the sector in intricate detail, a web of contour lines that swirled and eddied like the currents of a frozen sea. The peaks were marked with triangles, their elevations printed in tiny, precise numbers that had no meaning in the dark. Mount Varos, 2,400 meters. The Sisters, 2,100 meters. The names were abstract, titles given to piles of rock that cared nothing for human nomenclature. The guard traced the route the clockmaker would have taken. A thin, dotted line that wound its way up the valley floor, crossed the river at the stone bridge, and then began the switchbacks up the face of the ridge. In his mind, he walked the path. He felt the crunch of the snow under his boots, the bite of the wind on his cheeks, the burning of the lungs in the thin air. He imagined the darkness of the ravine, where the shadows were absolute and the only light came from the stars if the mist ever broke. But the mist would not break. The map showed a shelter halfway up, a small stone hut marked with a square symbol. Would Elias reach it? Or would the weight of the brass gears and the steel springs drag him down into a drift? The guard stared at the paper terrain, his eyes following the ink until it disappeared into the crease where the map had been folded for years. It was a simulation of travel, a journey taken without moving a muscle. The wind outside changed its pitch again. It dropped from a high keening to a low, resonant bass note that vibrated the floor. It was a sound of immense power, a displacement of air on a planetary scale. The building shuddered. A fine dust fell from the ceiling beams, dancing in the lantern light like golden motes. The guard watched them fall. They settled on the desk, on the ledger on the back of his hand. He did not brush them away. They were part of the accumulation, the slow sedimentation of the night. He picked up the pen. He held it horizontally, balancing it on his index finger. He watched it teeter, then settle. It was a game of equilibrium. The pen was black, shiny, a cylinder of potential communication that currently had nothing to say. He placed it back on the blotter, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the book. Parallel lines, right angles. Geometry was the antidote to the chaos of the storm. He opened the drawer of the desk. It slid out with a dry scrape of wood on wood. Inside, the contents were arranged with the same obsessive order. A spare bottle of ink, the glass dark and dusty. A box of steel nibs rattling faintly. A stack of blank forms, their edges crisp and white. A small folding knife with a handle of bone, and a photograph. He did not take the photograph out. He looked at it as it lay in the drawer, face up. It was a picture of a house, a small cottage with a slate roof and a garden of summer flowers. It was a memory of a different climate, a different life. The colors were faded, the greens turning to blue, the reds to brown. He stared at it for a moment, acknowledging its existence, then closed the drawer. Click. The memory was filed away, returned to the dark. He looked at the clock. The hands had moved, but the time felt static. It was deep in the AM hours now, that stretch of the night where the world stops breathing and the darkness is at its heaviest. The ticking was the only measurement of progress. Tick, tick, tick. It was a slow, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to slow down the beating of his own heart. He felt his pulse in his wrist, resting against the edge of the desk. Thump, thump. It was synchronized with the clock, a biological rhythm entrained to a mechanical one. He stood up. The movement was necessary to keep the blood from pooling. He walked the perimeter of the room, 4 paces to the door, turn, 4 paces to the window, turn, 4 paces to the stove, turn. It was a patrol of a cell, a sentry duty within a sentry box. He stopped at the stove and opened the door. The fire was a bed of glowing coals, a landscape of miniature volcanoes. He did not add fuel this time. The heat was sufficient. He just watched the combustion, the slow consumption of the earth's stored energy. The light from the fire illuminated the lower half of his face, casting long, upward shadows that made his eyes look like empty sockets. He closed the stove door. He walked to the corner where the broom stood. He picked it up. The handle was smooth, polished by the grip of many hands. He swept the floor. There was nothing to sweep, really, just the dust that had fallen from the ceiling and the invisible debris of the hours. But the action was soothing. Swish, swish, swish. The straw bristles scratched against the wood, a dry, whispering sound. He swept the dust into a small pile near the door. He picked it up with a metal dustpan and threw it into the stove. A brief flare of yellow light and the dust was gone. The room was clean. The ritual was complete. He returned to the seat. He felt the fatigue now, a heavy, dull ache behind the eyes. The adrenaline of the visitor had worn off, leaving behind a hollow feeling. He was tired, but sleep was forbidden. Sleep was a surrender. He had to remain conscious to maintain the vigil. He reached for the water jug that sat on the floor. It was an earthenware vessel, heavy and cool. He poured a small amount into the tin cup. The water was cold, tasting of the clay. He drank it slowly, feeling the liquid slide down his throat, a cold snake entering his warm core. It woke him up slightly, a shock to the system. He looked at the lantern again. The wick was carbonizing at the tip, a small mushroom of black soot forming in the flame. This caused the light to flicker slightly, a rhythmic dimming that was irritating to the eye. He reached out and carefully trimmed the wick with a small pair of scissors he kept in the pen tray. Snip! The mushroom fell. The flame brightened, becoming steady and tall once more. The light in the room stabilized. The shadows stopped dancing and returned to their assigned places in the corners. He listened. The wind was still there, a constant companion, but was there another sound, a scraping, a scratching? He held his breath. He leaned his head to the side, presenting his ear to the wall. Scritch, scritch. It was coming from the roof. A branch, a bird. No, a bird would be frozen solid. It was likely a piece of ice sliding down the shingles, catching on a nail, then sliding again. Or perhaps the wood itself, contracting in the intense cold, snapping fibers one by one. He let the sound go. It was not a threat. It was just the building talking. He looked at the ledger. The last entry was still Elia's M. The ink was dry, permanent. The page was a record of the night. Anton V. and Elia's M. Two names. Two lives intersecting at this point in space and time, then diverging into the mist. He wondered where Anton was now. Probably miles to the north, sleeping in a heated cabin, his truck parked in a row of other trucks. And Elia's. Probably still walking, one foot in front of the other, the rucksack cutting into his shoulders. The guard felt a strange sense of responsibility for them. He had stamped their papers. He had allowed them to proceed. He was the gatekeeper. If they failed, if the mountain took them, did a part of that failure belong to him? He pushed the thought away. His duty was the line, not the fate of those who crossed it. The regulations were clear. Verify, stamp, record. The rest was nature. He picked up the magnifying glass again. He held it over the surface of the desk, examining the grain of the wood. It was oak, dark and hard. Under the glass, the grain looked like a landscape of rivers and valleys, a topographical map of the tree's life. He saw the pores, the scratches, the stains of ink and tea. It was a history written in cellulose and lignin. He moved the glass to his own hand. He saw the ridges of his fingerprint, the dry flakes of skin, the tiny hairs on his knuckle. He was a landscape too, weathering under the erosion of the years. He put the glass down. He looked at the window. The frost was thicker still. It seemed to be growing inward, encroaching on the room. He imagined the ice filling the booth, a slow, creeping solid that would eventually encase him in crystal, preserving him like an insect in amber. He would sit there for eternity, pen in hand, waiting for a traveler who would never come. The image was not frightening, it was peaceful, a cessation of duty, a final stillness. He shook his head, dispelling the vision. He was alive, the stove was hot, the clock was ticking. He had a job to do. He checked the time. It was late or early. The distinction was meaningless. It was simply now. He reached for the logbook, turning back to the very first page of the current volume. The date was from 6 months ago, summer. The entries were numerous then. Tourists, hikers, locals crossing to visit family. The handwriting was different, lighter, more hurried. The ink was blue. He remembered those days, the sun staying up until late in the evening, the sound of cowbells from the lower pastures, the dust on the road. It seemed like a different life, a different world. Now the world had contracted to this. The gray, the cold, the black ink. He closed the book. The heavy cover fell with a thud, thump. It was the sound of a gavel, order in the court of the night. He sat back, clasping his hands behind his head, stretching his back. His spine cracked, pop, pop. He felt the tension release slightly. He looked up at the ceiling. The beams were rough-hewn, darkened by smoke. He counted the knots in the wood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A constellation of imperfections. He knew them all. They were his stars. The wind gusted, a sudden violent shove against the south wall. The lantern swung on its hook, the shadows lurching. The guard did not move. He rode out the turbulence. The booth held. It was built for this. It was anchored to the rock. It would not fall. He lowered his hands and placed them on the desk. He was ready. He was waiting. The night was long, but he was patient. He was the stone in the river. He was the ice on the glass. He was the guard. He stared at the flame, letting his mind go blank, entering the meditative state of the watch. No thoughts, no time, just the flame, the yellow, flickering heart of the world. And the mist pressed against the glass, seeking a way in. The night had now deepened into a profound and heavy trench of time, a period of hours where the concept of morning seemed like a distant, abstract theory rather than an inevitable celestial event. The guard sat within this trench, submerged in the stillness that was not merely a lack of noise, but a positive pressure, a density of the atmosphere that pushed against the eardrums and settled into the pores of the wood. The wind had ceased its erratic gusting and had settled into a constant, low-frequency drone, a monolithic sound that vibrated the very foundation of the outpost, turning the booth into a resonating chamber for the mountain's breath. The temperature outside had stabilized at a point where the mercury in the thermometer had ceased to function as a liquid, retreating into the bulb in a huddled mass of red alcohol, refusing to measure the severity of the freeze. Inside, the ecosystem of the booth was undergoing a subtle shift. The lantern, which had been the unwavering sun of this small universe for hours, began to exhibit signs of exhaustion. The flame, previously a tall, steady tongue of yellow fire, began to pulsate. It dipped and flared in a rhythmic oscillation, a visual gasping for fuel. The oil in the glass reservoir had been consumed, drawn up through the cotton fibers of the wick by capillary action, and transformed into light and heat, leaving only a shallow dregs of amber liquid at the bottom. With each pulse of the dying flame, the shadows in the room leaped forward and then retreated, a slow, hypnotic expansion and contraction of the darkness that made the walls seem to breathe. The guard watched this process with a detached clinical interest. He knew the signs. The chemistry of the combustion was failing. The hydrocarbon chain was breaking. He did not move immediately to rectify it. He allowed the entropy to proceed, watching the light shift from a warm, bright yellow to a dull, smoky orange. The corners of the room disappeared into the gloom. The map on the wall became a gray rectangle. The clock face dimmed, the numbers becoming difficult to distinguish from the background. The booth was dying, fading into the obscurity of the past. Finally, when the flame was no more than a blue bead hovering on the charred tip of the wick, he stood up. The movement was slow, an unfolding of limbs that had stiffened in the cold draft. He walked to the cupboard beneath the shelves, the wood of the floorboards groaning under the shift in weight. He opened the cupboard door. It swung on dry hinges, revealing the dark, musty interior where the supplies were kept. He reached in and grasped the handle of the oil canister. It was a heavy, rectangular tin, painted a utilitarian olive drab that was chipped and scratched to reveal the steel beneath. The sides of the tin were dented, evidence of rough handling during delivery. He lifted it out, the liquid inside sloshing with a heavy, viscous sound. Glug glug. It was the sound of stored energy, of ancient sunlight trapped in fluid form. He carried the canister to the desk and set it down. The metal rang against the wood, a dull, hollow note. He returned to the lantern. He reached up and turned the brass wheel to lower the wick. The flame struggled, flickered once, and then vanished. PFFF. The light was extinguished. For a moment the darkness was absolute. The guard stood in the center of a black void, his eyes adjusting painfully to the sudden absence of the visual world. Then slowly, the secondary light source revealed itself. The stove in the corner was glowing. The vents in the cast-iron door were eyes of deep, sullen red, projecting a faint, hellish illumination across the floor. The light was weak, barely reaching the desk, but it was enough to navigate by. It painted the room in shades of copper and blood, turning the familiar objects into strange, ominous silhouettes. The guard worked by feel as much as by sight. He lifted the lantern from its hook, the metal bale handle warm to the touch. He set it on the desk next to the canister. He unscrewed the burner assembly. The threads were fine and required a delicate touch. He twisted the brass mechanism counterclockwise. Screech. The metal complained. He lifted the burner out, the long, wet tail of the wick dangling from the bottom, dripping oil onto the blotter. He set it aside on a small ceramic saucer kept for this purpose. He unscrewed the cap of the canister. The smell of kerosene filled the room instantly, a sharp, pungent chemical odor that cut through the stale air like a knife. It was the smell of the station, the signature scent of the border. He lifted the heavy tin, tilting it carefully over the open mouth of the lantern reservoir. He poured. The stream of oil was invisible in the dark, but he could hear it. A steady, gurgling sound as the fluid transferred from the tin to the glass. Glug, glug, glug. He listened to the pitch of the sound rising as the reservoir filled, a sonic gauge of the level. He stopped just as the pitch reached the note he recognized as full. He lowered the tin, a single drop of oil escaping the spout and landing on his thumb. It felt cold and oily, a slick contaminant. He screwed the cap back onto the canister and set it on the floor. He picked up the burner assembly and lowered the wick back into the fresh fuel. The cotton drank greedily. He screwed the brass ring back into place, tightening it until it seated firmly against the glass. Now the resurrection of the light. He opened the matchbox. He selected a match, feeling the rough wooden stick and the bulbous head of sulfur. He struck it against the side of the box. Scritch hefwy. A spark, then a flare of white phosphorus light that blinded him for a second. The flame settled into a small, yellow teardrop on the end of the wood. He brought the match to the wick. The oil-soaked cotton caught instantly. A ring of blue fire jumped around the base of the wick, then grew upwards, transforming into a stable yellow flame. The light flooded back into the room, pushing the red glow of the stove back into the corner, reclaiming the territory of the desk, the ledger, and the man. The shadows retreated to the ceiling. The world was restored. The guard blew out the match, a thin trail of gray smoke joining the kerosene fumes. He placed the burnt stick in the ashtray. He hung the lantern back on its hook. It swung gently, casting a moving arc of light that made the room feel like the cabin of a ship at sea, rolling in the swell of the storm. He watched it until the swinging stopped and the light became static again. He wiped his hands on a rag, removing the trace of the oil. He sat back down on the stool. The interruption was over. The routine resumed. But the brief period of darkness had left a residue in his mind. It was a reminder of how fragile the outpost was, how dependent it was on the supply chain, on the chemistry of combustion. Without the oil, the booth was just a wooden coffin in the snow. He looked at the ledger. The page was still open to the entries of Anton V. and Elias M. The ink seemed darker now, more permanent in the fresh light. He ran his finger down the empty lines that followed. The paper was smooth, the blue rules faint. These were the hours of the void, the hours where no one traveled, the hours that belonged to the ghosts of the past. He picked up the pen just to feel the weight of it. He did not write. There was nothing to record but the passage of time itself, and that was already being done by the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was relentless. It was a machine that chewed up seconds and spit them out into the past. He looked at the window. The frost on the inside of the glass had thickened. It was no longer just a flat coating, it had depth and texture. It was a landscape of its own, a miniature range of mountains growing out of the glass. He reached out and touched it. His fingertip stuck for a fraction of a second, the moisture of his skin freezing to the ice before pulling away with a tiny tearing sensation. The cold was intense, burning the nerve endings. He looked at the spot on the glass. He had left a small, clear oval where his body heat had melted the crystals. Through it, he saw only blackness. The mist was gone, or rather, it was invisible in the dark. There was only the night. He turned his attention to the stove. The red glow had faded now that the room was bright again, but the heat was still there, a solid wall of thermal energy radiating from the iron. He needed to tend to it. He picked up the poker and opened the door. The coals were settling, turning from red to gray ash on the outside. He stirred them, breaking the crust, exposing the hot core. Sparks flew up, angry and bright. He added 2 more lumps of coal from the bucket. They were the last large pieces. The bucket was nearly empty again. The consumption was constant. He closed the door and adjusted the damper. The stove sighed, a rush of air being drawn into the firebox. He sat back, feeling the warmth wash over his legs. It was a localized comfort. His feet were still cold. His back was still cold, but his face and hands were warm. It was enough. He thought about the geological history of the mountains outside. They were sedimentary rock, pushed up from the bottom of an ancient ocean millions of years ago. The fossils of sea creatures were trapped in the stone, high above the clouds. Shells, bones, the imprints of fins. They were the original travelers, crossing a different kind of border from life to stone. The guard felt a kinship with them. He, too, was becoming a fixture of the landscape, a stationary object around which the weather flowed. He looked at the floorboards. They were pine, worn smooth by the boots of his predecessors. He could see the wear patterns, a lighter path leading from the door to the desk and from the desk to the stove, a triangle of movement. He was walking in the footsteps of ghosts, men who had sat on this stool 10, 20, 30 years ago. Men who had watched the same mist, felt the same cold, written in the same ledgers. Where were they now? Retired, dead. Or perhaps they were still here, absorbed into the wood, their sighs echoing in the draft. He reached for the tobacco tin again. He opened it. It was half full. The smell of the cured leaf was sweet and earthy. He did not roll a cigarette this time. He just smelled it, inhaling the aroma of a warmer place. A place where tobacco grew in the sun, where the soil was dark and rich, where the rain was warm. It was a sensory anchor, a connection to the south. He closed the tin and put it back in the drawer. He was rationing his pleasures. He was rationing his thoughts. The wind outside shifted, coming now from the east. It hit the corner of the booth with a new sound, a sharp, whistling note that sounded like a flute played by a madman. The tone rose and fell, bending with the gusts. The guard listened to the music of the storm. It was a complex composition, full of dissonance and resolving chords. It was the soundtrack of the isolation. He looked at the stamp pad. The lid was closed. The violet ink was sealed away, waiting for the next passport. He wondered if there would be another one tonight. The odds were low. The weather was too severe, but the possibility remained. A desperate traveler, a lost soul, a military courier. He had to be ready. The regulations did not allow for sleep. He sat up straighter, correcting his posture. He was the representative of the state. He had to embody the alertness of the border. He fixed his eyes on the window, on the small clear oval he had melted. He watched the blackness. He began to count the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. He synced his counting with the clock. He was trying to measure the duration of the night, but the numbers became meaningless. 1,000, 2,000. The night was infinite. It was a loop of time repeating itself over and over. The same wind, the same cold, the same silence. He felt a heaviness in his chest. It was not pain, but a weight. The weight of the solitude, the weight of the silence. It pressed down on his lungs, making it harder to breathe. He took a deep breath, forcing the air into his chest. He exhaled slowly, a long sigh that mingled with the draft. He looked at the flame of the lantern. It was burning steadily now, fed by the fresh oil. It was a small, brave thing, fighting the darkness. He felt a wave of affection for it. It was his only friend. It was the only thing that was alive in the room besides himself. He reached out and hovered his hand near the glass chimney. He could feel the heat rising from it. It was real. The physics of the world were still functioning. Combustion, convection, radiation. As long as the laws of physics held, he was safe. He checked the time again. It was the hour of the wolf, the deepest part of the night, the time when the body temperature is lowest, when the mind is most vulnerable to hallucinations. He kept his eyes focused on hard objects, the desk, the stove, the pen. He anchored himself in the material world. He heard a sound, tap. It came from the window. He looked. A small bird, a sparrow, had hit the glass. It fluttered for a moment against the frost, a tiny bundle of feathers and panic, illuminated by the light. Then it fell away, dropping into the snow below. The guard stood up and went to the window. He peered through the hole. He couldn't see the bird. It was buried in the drift. It would freeze in minutes. A small tragedy, a life extinguished by the glass wall. He felt a pang of sorrow, not for the bird specifically, but for the fragility of life in this place. The bird had sought the light, the warmth, and had found only a barrier. It was a metaphor for something, but he was too tired to decipher it. He returned to the stool. He sat down, he picked up the pen, he dipped it in the inkwell, he held it over the blotter. He watched the ink glisten on the nib. Black blood. He waited for the next event, the next sound, the next traveler, but there was only the wind, and the cold, and the ticking of the clock, and the night went on. The incident with the bird, the brief, soft collision of life against the barrier of the glass, faded into the past with the same inexorable speed as the tracks of the truck and the footprints of the clockmaker. The snow, falling with a relentless, silent determination, had already begun its work of burial. Outside the window, on the ledge where the small creature had fallen, a fresh drift was forming, a smooth, white curve that softened the angles of the architecture and erased the evidence of the tragedy. To the mountain, the event was not a tragedy. It was merely a transfer of energy, a cessation of movement, a return of biological matter to the cold, neutral embrace of the drift. The guard did not look again. He knew the outcome. The frost on the pane had already begun to heal the small, clear oval he had melted with his fingertip, the ice crystals growing inward from the edges like scar tissue closing a wound, sealing the booth once more into its blind, white solitude. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the leather cover of the ledger, his fingers splayed wide as if to hold the book down against the updraft of the room. The atmosphere within the booth had thickened, becoming a palpable medium that seemed to slow the passage of light and sound. The air smelled of the burnt wick, the sulfur of the coal, and the deep, resinous scent of the pine logs that formed the walls, a scent that was released only when the wood was subjected to the extreme thermal stress of the fire on one side and the freezing gale on the other. It was the smell of endurance, of organic material holding its structure against the void. The silence was no longer a void. It was a choir of low-frequency vibrations. The guard could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, a rhythmic whoosh-whoosh that synced with the beating of his heart. He could hear the settling of the coal in the stove, the microscopic shifting of the clinkers as they cooled and contracted. He could hear the wind stroking the roof, a sound like a giant hand smoothing a sheet of rough canvas. These sounds were the texture of the night, a tapestry of acoustic details that could only be perceived in the absence of all other stimuli. He lowered his gaze to the surface of the desk. In the amber light of the lantern, the wood appeared as a landscape of immense complexity. The grain of the oak flowed like a river of dark honey, swirling around the knots that stood like islands in the stream. He traced the path of a single grain line with his eyes, following it from the edge of the blotter under the inkwell, past the base of the lamp, and off the edge of the table. It was a journey of inches that felt like miles. He noticed the scratches in the varnish, the accumulation of decades of use. There were deep gouges where a heavy box had been dragged, shallow crisscrossing lines where coins had been counted, and circular stains where hot mugs had been set down by guards whose names were now just ink in the archives. He focused on a single brass screw that held the brass plate of the inkwell stand. The head of the screw was tarnished, the slot filled with a tiny amount of gray dust. The metal was dull, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. He thought about the person who had driven that screw years ago. The torque applied by the hand, the bite of the threads into the wood, the final turn to secure the object. That moment of effort was preserved here, a fossil of labor frozen in brass and oak. The booth was a museum of such small, forgotten acts. Every nail, every plank, every hinge was a testament to a human hand that had once been warm and moving, now absent. The guard felt a heaviness in his eyelids, a gravitational pull that sought to close the shutters of his vision. He did not fight it aggressively, he simply resisted with a passive, hydraulic pressure. He blinked, the motion slow and deliberate like the shutter of an old camera. Click, darkness, click, light. The afterimage of the lantern flame lingered on his retina, a purple ghost that floated in the middle distance, superimposed over the map on the wall. He looked at the map. The paper was beginning to buckle slightly in the humidity generated by his breath and the tea. The contour lines, those intricate loops of brown ink that defined the elevation of the pass, seemed to be moving. They appeared to crawl slowly across the paper, shifting and writhing like worms in the soil. It was an illusion of fatigue, a trick of the mind seeking pattern and movement in the static field. He stared at the spot marked the Sisters, two peaks that stood sentinel over the northern approach. On the map, they were just concentric circles. In reality, they were millions of tons of granite, sheathed in ice, indifferent to the map-maker's pen. He wondered about the clockmaker, Elias. By now, he would be deep in the ravine, miles from the comfort of the fire. Was he still walking? Or had he found the shelter? The guard imagined the man huddled in the stone hut, the rucksack of gears pulled close to his chest for warmth, listening to the same wind that buffeted the booth. The connection between them was thin, a thread of memory stretching out into the storm. The guard felt a strange sense of solidarity. They were both keepers of time, one carrying the mechanism, the other watching it pass. He reached for the pocket watch that hung from a chain on his vest. He pulled it out. The metal case was silver, worn smooth like a river stone. He pressed the catch. The lid popped open, snick. The face was white porcelain, cracked slightly near the number 4. The hands were delicate filigree, black and sharp. He watched the second hand. It swept around the dial in a series of tiny, jerky movements. Tick, tick, tick. It did not flow, it stuttered. Time was not a continuous stream, but a sequence of discrete moments, chopped up by the escapement mechanism. He listened to the sound. It was the heartbeat of the machine, a metallic pulse that drove the universe forward, 1 second at a time. He wound the watch. CR, 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 CR. The sensation of the spring tightening inside the barrel was satisfying. It was a transfer of potential energy from his fingers to the mechanism, a storage of power that would keep the time alive for another day. He closed the lid and slipped the watch back into his pocket. The weight of it against his ribs was comforting, a small anchor in the drift of the night. The stove gave a sudden, sharp pop, a pocket of gas in the coal exploding. A puff of ash blew out from the vent, a small gray cloud that swirled in the draft before settling on the hearth. The guard watched it fall. The fire was burning low again. The intense, roaring heat of the earlier hours had subsided into a steady, sullen radiation. The coals were a bed of deep garnet red, covered in a blanket of gray velvet ash. The heat they threw was heavy and somber, a sleep-inducing warmth that soaked into the heavy wool of his trousers and made his legs feel like lead. He knew he should add more coal, but the lethargy was strong. He decided to wait, to let the temperature drop a fraction more, to feel the edge of the cold again, just to remind himself of the boundary. He sat still, letting the invisible tide of the frost creep closer to the desk. He could feel it on the backs of his hands, a subtle numbing of the skin. He could feel it in his nose, the air becoming sharper, more brittle. He looked at the window again. The ice had thickened to the point where it was no longer just frost. It was a structural element of the building. The glass was merely a substrate for the crystal growth. The patterns were fractal, infinite in their complexity. Ferns, feathers, mountain ranges, cityscapes, all drawn in frozen water. He leaned forward, squinting to see the details. In one corner, the ice looked like a forest of pine trees, tiny and white. In another, it looked like the waves of a storm-tossed sea. It was a Rorschach test of the winter, reflecting the emptiness of the observer. The wind outside had shifted its tone. It was no longer a howl or a whistle. It was a drone, a constant monotonic vibration that seemed to be coming from the earth itself. It was the sound of the planet rotating in the void, the friction of the atmosphere against the lithosphere. The guard felt it in the soles of his boots. He was standing on a spinning rock, hurtling through a cold, dark universe, protected only by a thin layer of gas and a wooden shack. The thought was vertiginous. He gripped the edge of the desk, grounding himself. He opened the drawer to retrieve the cloth he used to clean the pen. He found it, a square of flannel stained with ink. He unfolded it and began to wipe the barrel of the pen, polishing the black resin until it shone. The motion was repetitive, soothing. Rub, turn, rub, turn. He cleaned the cap, the clip, the grip section. He treated the object with reverence. It was his tool, his scepter. Without the pen, there was no record. Without the record, there was no border. He placed the pen back on the desk, aligning it with the edge of the ledger. He checked the alignment with the stamp pad. He checked the alignment with the lamp. Symmetry was order. Order was safety. He adjusted the position of the stamp by a millimeter, satisfying an internal need for geometric perfection. He stood up, his knees popping loudly. He needed to circulate the blood. He began to pace. The floorboards creaked in a familiar sequence. The third board from the desk groaned. The fifth board squeaked. The board near the door was silent but bowed under his weight. He walked the path he had worn into the wood, back and forth, back and forth. He was a pendulum swinging in the confinement of the case. He stopped at the shelves and looked at the spines of the old ledgers. 1948, 1949, 1950, years of silence, years of snow. He wondered if the guards who wrote in those books had felt this same heaviness, this same detachment from reality. Did they stand here in this exact spot and listen to the wind? Did they watch the frost grow? He felt their presence in the shadows. They were the silent watchers, the ancestors of the post. He was just the current vessel for the duty. He pulled a book from the shelf, not to open it, but just to hold the weight of it. It was heavy, dense with paper and ink. It smelled of mildew and time. He held it with both hands, feeling the texture of the canvas cover. It was cold to the touch. He put it back, sliding it into the gap. Thump. The sound was final. He returned to the stove. The cold had crept too close. It was time to push it back. He picked up the shovel. He opened the door. The red eyes of the fire stared at him. He fed the beast. 3 scoops of coal. The black lumps hit the red bed with a dull crashing sound. Dust rose. He closed the door. He adjusted the damper. He waited. Slowly, the sound of the fire changed. The silence of the dying coals was replaced by the crackle and hiss of ignition. The fresh coal began to burn. The heat increased. The wave of warmth pushed outward, reclaiming the room. The guard felt it hit his face, a physical caress. He closed his eyes and basked in it. It was the only luxury he had. He sat back down. He checked the clock. The hands had moved, but the night was still long. The hour of the wolf was passing, giving way to the dead hours before the false dawn. This was the time when the spirit was weakest, when the hallucinations were most vivid. He kept his eyes open. He focused on the flame of the lantern. He noticed a small moth, a tiny gray thing fluttering near the ceiling. It must have hatched from the firewood, woken from its dormancy by the heat. It flew in erratic circles, drawn to the light but afraid of the heat. It was a small, confused life, trapped in a world it did not understand. The guard watched it. It flew closer to the lantern. It bumped against the glass chimney. Tink. It flew away. It came back. Tink. It was a dance of doom. The guard did not interfere. He was an observer. The moth would either burn or freeze. There were no other options in the booth. He looked at the inkwell. The black liquid was still a dark mirror. He dipped the pen just to break the surface tension. Ripples spread out, bouncing off the glass walls of the well. He watched them fade. He wiped the nib on the blotter. He did not write. The wind gusted again, a sudden violence that shook the door in its frame. The latch rattled, click-clack. It sounded like someone trying the handle. The guard looked at the door. He knew it was just the wind. But the lizard brain, the primitive part of his mind, whispered intruder. He stared at the latch. It held. The bolt was solid. The wind passed. The rattling stopped. He exhaled a long breath that he didn't realize he had been holding. The tension in his shoulders dropped. He was alone, safe in the box. He thought about the morning. It would come eventually. The gray light would seep through the ice on the window. The mist would reveal the shapes of the trees. The world would return to color, however muted. But for now, the world was binary. Black and white, hot and cold, inside and outside. He wrapped his coat tighter. He pulled his hat down. He prepared for the final stretch of the night. The endurance was a marathon, and he was in the last miles. He felt a strange calm. He had survived the darkest part. He was still here. He looked at the empty chair opposite him, the chair where no one sat. He imagined a visitor, a ghost, a memory, but the chair remained empty. The wood was bare. He was the sole inhabitant of the checkpoint, the sole witness to the mist. He rested his chin in his hand. He listened to the clock. Tick, tick, tick. He waited for the dawn that was still hours away. He waited for the silence to break. He waited. And the snow continued to fall, burying the pass, burying the road, burying the world in white. The passage of the night had now stretched the fabric of time to its absolute limit, thinning the boundary between the present moment and the eternity of the mountain. The guard sat at the center of this attenuation, a solitary anchor in a sea of duration that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The booth, which had been a vessel of warmth and light navigating the darkness, was now settling into the heavy, silent inertia of the pre-dawn hours. The wind, having spent its fury against the walls throughout the long middle watch, had receded into a distant, murmuring presence, a low-tide sound that whispered of exhaustion and retreat. The silence that filled the space left behind by the gale was not empty. It was dense, granular, and packed with the microscopic debris of the night, the dust of the coal, the ash of the tobacco, the frozen breath of the hours. He looked at the stove. The fire had burned down to a deep, slumbering bed of embers, a landscape of dark red geology that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heat. The iron of the stove body had lost its angry orange glow and returned to a dull, matte black, absorbing the shadows of the room. The heat it radiated was no longer a sharp, aggressive defense against the cold, but a soft, pervasive warmth that felt like the memory of a fire rather than the fire itself. It was a heavy warmth, one that soaked into the wool of the uniform and the wood of the floor, weighing down the eyelids and slowing the pulse. The guard felt gravity pulling at him, a gentle, insistent force that sought to merge him with the furniture, to turn him into another fixture of the outpost. He shifted his weight and the stool creaked, a long, dry complaint of old timber that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the insulation of the snow. He placed his hands flat on the desk. The wood was cool to the touch, the heat of the lamp having retreated. He looked at his hands. They were pale, the skin dry and mapped with the fine lines of dehydration. They looked like parchment, like the pages of the ledger he guarded. He flexed his fingers, watching the tendons move under the skin. It was a slow, mechanical action, the testing of a biological machine that had been running for too long. He turned his gaze to the window. The transformation had begun, though it was almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. The solid wall of blackness that had pressed against the glass for hours was softening. It was not yet light, but the quality of the dark had changed. It had shifted from the absolute, void-like black of the deep night to a heavy, saturated indigo, a color that felt cold and vast. The frost on the window pane, which had acted as a mirror reflecting the interior of the booth, began to lose its reflective quality. The crystals of ice, built up in intricate, fern-like layers, began to glow with a faint, internal luminescence. They were catching the first, scattered photons of the coming day, trapping them in their frozen lattices. The guard watched this shift in the spectrum. It was the only clock that mattered. The mechanical clock on the wall continued its relentless ticking, tick, 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 but its numbers were abstract. The light on the ice was real. It was the physical evidence of planetary rotation, the slow turning of the Earth back towards the sun. He leaned forward, squinting through the thicket of frost. He could not yet see the trees or the road, but he could sense their presence returning. The world was reforming out of the mist, assembling itself from the gray shadows. He reached for the ledger one last time. The page was open to the entries of the night. Anton V. Elias M. The name stood out in the blue-black ink, stark and final. Below them, the lines were empty, a ladder of blank spaces that led down to the bottom of the page. The guard picked up the pen. He did not write. He simply held it, feeling the balance, the potential. There would be no more travelers this shift. The night was done. The history of this specific darkness was written. He capped the pen. The sound of the cap clicking into place was loud, a sharp punctuation mark in the quiet. He placed the pen in the tray, aligning it perfectly with the groove in the wood. He closed the inkwell, clink. The lid settled. The liquid mirror was sealed away. He closed the ledger. The heavy cover fell with a dull thud, pushing a small puff of air across the desk. Thump. The book was closed. The record was sealed. He stood up. His knees were stiff, the joints locking for a moment before accepting the weight. He walked to the window, his boots sounding heavy and dull on the floorboards. He stopped at the glass and breathed on a patch of clear ice. The warmth of his breath fogged the surface, then cleared as the moisture evaporated, leaving a small, transparent portal. He looked out. The mist was still there, but it had changed character. It was no longer the terrifying, swirling chaos of the storm. It was a still, hanging vapor, a heavy blanket of gray silk that draped over the world. Through it, he could see the vague, dark shapes of the pine trees. They stood motionless, their branches weighed down by heavy loads of snow. They looked like monks in white robes, heads bowed in prayer. The barrier gate was a horizontal line of white, a stroke of chalk on a slate board. The road was a smooth, unbroken ribbon of white, the tracks of the truck and the footprints of the clockmaker completely erased by the night's accumulation. It was a pristine surface, a blank page waiting for the day's inscriptions. The light outside continued to grow. It was not a sunrise. There was no golden orb, no streaks of pink or orange. It was simply a lightening of the gray. The indigo faded to slate, the slate to charcoal, the charcoal to the color of dirty wool. The details of the landscape emerged slowly like a photograph developing in a darkroom tray. The texture of the snow became visible, the ripples, the drifts, the way it clung to the bark of the trees. The world was cold, monochromatic, and utterly still. The guard felt a chill seep through the glass. The temperature at dawn was often the lowest of the cycle, the final ebb of thermal energy before the return of the sun. He buttoned the top button of his coat. He adjusted his collar. He turned back to the room. The lantern was still burning, but its light now seemed yellow and sickly, competing with the cold, blue light filtering in from the window. The artificial light, which had been so comforting and necessary in the dark, now felt out of place, a relic of a time that had passed. He walked to the lantern. He reached up and turned the brass wheel. The wick descended. The flame shrank. It went from a tall tongue of fire to a small blue bead, and then, with a final flicker, it vanished. A thin trail of gray smoke rose from the chimney, smelling of extinguished paraffin. The room did not go dark. Instead, it was filled with the flat, shadowless light of the morning mist. The corners of the room were revealed in all their dusty reality. The cobwebs, the cracks in the plaster, the stains on the floor, everything was visible, stripped of the romance of the shadows. He walked to the stove. He did not add coal. The shift was ending. The fire would be allowed to die down, to become a bed of ash that the next guard would have to revive. He picked up the poker and pushed the remaining coals together, banking them in the center of the grate to preserve the last of the heat. The ash was gray and soft, like the mist outside. He closed the door. The red eyes of the vents were dim now, barely visible in the morning light. He went to the corner and picked up the broom. He swept the floor one last time, swish, swish, swish. He swept the dust from the door to the stove and from the stove to the desk. He was erasing his own presence, removing the evidence of his vigil. He collected the small pile of dust and threw it into the ash bucket. The room was clean. The order was maintained. He returned to the desk and sat on the stool. He was waiting now, not for a traveler but for the transition. He looked at the clock. The hand stood at the top of the dial. The shift was technically over, but in the mountains the clock is secondary to the light. He would wait until the sun, unseen behind the clouds, had fully claimed the sky. He looked at the map on the wall. The contour lines were distinct now, sharp brown lines on the yellow paper. The mystery of the geography had receded. The mountains were just mountains again, piles of rock and ice. The ravine was just a valley. The pass was just a road. The magic of the night, the sense of the unknown, had evaporated with the darkness. He felt a strange hollowness. The night shift was a burden, a heavy weight of solitude and vigilance, but it was also a possession. It belonged to him. The silence was his silence. The cold was his cold. Now, as the day approached, he had to give it up. He had to surrender the booth to the light, to the noise of the day, to the next man. He felt a pang of loss, a reluctance to let go of the stillness. He looked at the window again. The frost was losing its grip. The delicate crystals were beginning to blur, to lose their sharp edges as the temperature on the glass rose by a fraction of a degree. The view outside was clearing. He could see the far side of the road now. He could see the snowbank. He could see a single black bird, a raven, sitting on the top of the barrier gate. It sat perfectly still, a silhouette cut from black paper, watching the booth. The guard watched the bird. The bird watched the guard. They were the only two conscious things in the valley. Then the bird opened its wings and took flight, a silent, flapping motion that carried it up into the mist and out of sight. The gate was empty again. The guard stood up. He unbuttoned his coat. He took off his hat and placed it on the hook. He ran his hand through his hair, feeling the flatness where the hat had pressed it down. He rubbed his face, his skin feeling rough with the stubble of the night. He was tired. A deep, bone-weary tiredness that felt like a physical weight in his marrow. He walked to the door. He did not open it, he just checked the latch. It was secure. He walked to the water jug and poured the last few drops into the cup. He drank them. The water was room temperature now, flat and tasteless. He placed the cup upside down on the drainer. He looked around the room. The desk, the chair, the stove, the shelves, the map, the phone, everything was in its place. Everything was ready. The machine of the border was reset. He went back to the stool and sat down. He folded his hands on the desk. He closed his eyes for a moment. He listened. The wind had stopped completely. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of the morning, a different frequency than the silence of the night. It was a waiting silence, a pause before the world inhaled again. He opened his eyes. The light in the room was a pale, watery gray. It washed over the wood, bleaching the color out of the grain. The atmosphere was cold, clinical. He thought of Anton V. driving his truck through the north. He thought of Elias M., the clockmaker, perhaps now cresting the ridge. They were gone, moving through the white world. He remained. He was the stationary point, the pivot. He picked up the stamp, Border Post 39. He looked at the rubber die one last time. He cleaned a speck of dust from the letter B. He set it down. He looked at the window. The mist was brightening, turning a luminous white. The sun was somewhere up there behind the layers of cloud trying to break through. It wouldn't succeed, not today. It would be a day of gray light and flat shadows, a day of snow. The guard took a deep breath. He exhaled slowly. The breath did not form a cloud in the room anymore. The temperature had equalized. He was done. The night was over. The story of this shift was written in the ledger and in the rings of the wood. He sat in the gray light, his hands folded, his eyes open, his face a mask of calm. He was a part of the booth, a part of the pass, a part of the mist. He waited for the sound of boots on the gravel. He waited for the knock on the door that would release him. But for now, he simply sat. The snow began to fall again outside, large, lazy flakes drifting down from the white sky, covering the tracks, covering the bird's perch, covering the world.